just ignores you.
I'd like to welcome everybody to, today is May 10th, to the Finance and Operation Committee. I know it takes a minute to sit down, but we'll get started because I do have a few things to say before we get going.
I know.
I just want to draw your attention, those of you up here, to two items. With the end of the academic year, the student representative that would normally join us at the table, that they are not able to attend due to final schedules and study abroad opportunities. Student Rep Chair Joshua Preston has indicated that the group will provide any comments or concerns they have on the operating budget prior to the June meeting. I also want to draw your attention to the revised consent report, copies of which are now before you. I haven't actually checked, but they are before us. Okay, thank you. Our first item of business today is the President's recommended fiscal year 2019 annual operating budget. We are going to be starting with an overview of that budget and then have a deeper dive into the law school finances. I am going to say that we've got a lot to accomplish today, and we've allowed 90 minutes on the agenda for this. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take the first 60 minutes and talk about the operating budget. At that time, 60 minutes from when we start, we are going to stop the discussion on it and call no more speakers, even if they're in the queue, and then go to the law school finance issue. And we'll have 30 minutes on that. We're not acting on those today, so we've got the whole month to look to continue to operate. Before I turn it over to the presenters, I want to remind everyone that this item is for review today, and it'll take action at our June meeting. Between now and our June meeting, we'll be collecting feedback on the budget from the university community. The board will host 2 public input sessions, one at the Twin Cities campus and one at the Duluth campus. These sessions will include a brief overview presentation on the budget and an opportunity for community members to provide feedback with Regents individually or in small groups. More information on these events can be found on the Board of Regents website. Additionally, the board will launch an online feedback form to collect comments from the community. You can visit the board's website to submit your comments beginning at 5 p.m. today. The online comment period will close at noon on Tuesday, May 29th. Input received during that comment period will be included in the June docket and become part of the official public record. The name and affiliation of the commenter will also be included. With that all being said, I am going to turn it over to President Kaler for an overview of the operating budget, and at 2:32 we are going to be starting on the law school budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Anderson. As always, our proposed operating budget reflects a commitment to providing an affordable, high-quality education across all of our campuses. That includes, among other things, excellence in instruction, research, and public engagement, and reducing administrative costs by $90 million over the past 6 years. In fact, on that latter point, we're on the mark and then some. Once again, this operating budget reflects an added focus of directing available resources to support core operations and activities as a means to address these priorities. Because of where we stand with investments from the state and because of our commitment to operational excellence, I would describe my recommended fiscal year 2019 annual operating budget as bare bone. We're investing in what we have, and we're doing so by mostly taking from existing unit resources across the system. About 61% of our investments, mostly in compensation, are coming from cuts or reallocations from our units. In fact, of the $28 million we are investing, $19 million are real budget cuts that units will surely feel, as they've been feeling over the past 5 years as we've become a more efficient university. Meanwhile, just 39% of our new investments will come from increased tuition revenue. For more details, Regent Anderson, I'd like to turn this over now to Senior Vice President Burnett, Associate Vice President Tonnison, Executive Vice President Provost Hanson, and in 58 minutes, Law School Dean Jenkins.
Thank you very much, President Kaler. So I see Associate Vice President Tonnison is at the table, and Senior Vice President Burnett is up here. I will let you two take over.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board, and thank you, President Kaler. Here's our agenda for today's presentation. We purposely built a streamlined presentation. The docket obviously has a lot of detail, as you may have seen when as we loaded that up. And really today is to preserve as much time for discussion and robust discussion from the committee as we head towards getting this approved in the June timeframe. We intend to walk through the overall budget slides total in about 20 minutes and then preserve the remainder of the 56 minutes for discussion. Then, as was stated, the provost and the dean of the law school come forward to talk about that piece that was an appendix into the budget request, and obviously preserving a number of time for questions. The next slide is a brief overview of what's included in our budget plan, and it really talks about maintaining excellence and maintaining the core of this institution. And candidly, I would say it's very similar to the capital request we sent to the state legislature earlier this year that they're still considering. It is taking care of what we have. There are not a lot of new investments here. And candidly, I would say taking care of what we have, including our top talented faculty and staff, is the priority in this budget. It is the single largest budget, and it is a 2% salary pool that we are recommending. And so we have funded that with no new state money through a combination of recommended modest tuition increases and, as the President noted, and Julie will go into more detail, additional reallocations from units. But I think when you think about the 4 faculty you had before you this morning in the Mission Fulfillment Committee, and you think about the talent that the University of Minnesota can attract to come here and serve our students and serve the state of Minnesota, this is clearly about maintaining that excellence and maintaining the core of the university, and not a number of new initiatives in the FY19 budget. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Associate Vice President Tonneson to walk you through the remainder of the formal presentation on the budget.
Associate Vice President Tonneson, the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt. We just really want to deliver these letters. We're here from the
meeting. Please come to order.
If you could just take the letters, we've tried to speak with you multiple times in other ways, and so we're here to ask you for a public meeting, if that can happen over the summer. That's why we're delivering these letters.
Just keep it.
So we've tried to communicate with you in multiple ways. We've written letters, we've called. Last week, over 50 students and people from the University of Minnesota called to try to speak with the Board of Regents, and we didn't hear anything back, so that's why we're here speaking with you now. We are wondering if a public meeting can be scheduled for sometime this summer.
Meeting come to order, please. Meeting come to order.
Okay, Mr. Chair, members, good afternoon. I want to, on the budget, turn to the revenue pie chart for FY19 proposed revenue estimates. On an all funds basis, we are projecting to reach the $4 billion mark for the first time. I will draw your attention to the display.
It's ordered that this disruptive behavior cease. All those who fail to comply will be in violation of Minnesota criminal statutes, to include interference with the use of public property, disorderly conduct, and trespassing, and will be placed under arrest by University Police. Please continue.
Okay. As you can see, the pie chart of revenues that we've displayed here are by the color categories we talked about during the budget development time. Just over 30% of the $4 billion can be described as restricted funding. These are revenues defined by the source of the funds to address targeted and specific areas of spending. They cannot be moved elsewhere within the budget. To address other things and must be spent on what the provider indicates as their purpose. The yellow slice at about 9% of the total is our estimated auxiliary revenue. This is the revenue generated by the businesses of the institution, bookstores, parking, and so forth. That ideally not only cover their direct costs of operating, but also provide some coverage of their share of general overhead costs. The blue I want to mention is included here today because it represents budgeted managed financial activity associated with our internal sales. This is when one university department sells to another. This 6% of the pie is eliminated from a financial statement perspective of the budget when we present a financial statement view of the financials, but we'd include it here because it is budgeted activity. And then in the green, there are two shades. The lighter green at 15.4% of the total represents fees, sales, clinical income, etc. Funds that are generated by the units differentially based on their unique activities and characteristics and are technically unrestricted but are necessary to cover costs associated with generating those revenues. And then finally, the largest piece of the pie at 39% is the darker green, which is the large discretionary revenue sources for the institution available to address all kinds of costs related to instruction, research, and outreach. For FY19, we're estimating approximately 25% of our financial resources will come from tuition, that is before waivers, and about 14% will come from the state of Minnesota through the O&M appropriation. Total state funding would be about 17% of the total if you combine that O&M piece with the restricted state special that's in red. On the right side of the chart, we've displayed the totals we anticipate coming from the funds we call centrally distributed and attributed, those that the budget process focuses on most to cover the core costs of the university. This is really dominated by tuition and the O&M appropriation. The budget before you for review anticipates slight growth in those centrally attributed and distributed funds for FY19 and also a growth in the year-end balances in those funds. The balance gain is coming almost entirely from a growth in central reserves that we recommend to allow to remain within the fund rather than being spent. We'll talk more about the changes and proposals in the budget framework funds in subsequent slides, but for the other sources, this budget bases estimated revenues on a combination of trend analysis and some planned activity changes, as in the case of auxiliary rates. The $4 billion in total represents a $46 million or 1.2% increase from the FY18 projected revenues. Digging in a bit to the budget recommendations around the dark green slices of the pie, which would include the state funding and tuition primarily. As you recall from previous discussions, the budget framework is a construct we use to explain the incremental changes in that budget. This slide summarizes the incremental changes in resources used to pay for the incremental increases in expenditures. The budget for these framework funds is structurally balanced with $100,000 on the bottom line. Incremental expenditures are supported by the combination of increased tuition revenue and internal expense reductions or reallocations. As you can see, the majority of the solution, 61%, comes from repurposing existing university resources, and 70% of that, or $19 million, as President Kaler mentioned, comes from plans to cut expenditures in units to free up resources. The incremental $46.4 million we propose to allocate to the categories of spending you see on the bottom of the chart. Here, the majority, 69%, is for compensation cost increases consistent with the priorities mentioned earlier. We'll briefly discuss these spending changes in an upcoming slide. But first, the President's recommendations on tuition rate changes are detailed here for our primary or major tuition categories. In total, these changes are estimated to generate $18.1 million in incremental revenue. Starting from the bottom, you can see that many of the professional rates here are proposed to increase 2%. The rate changes are based on a review of several factors, including the cost trends that are in the school, the individual rates position compared to their peer institutions, student debt loads, and so forth. Two notable exceptions to the 2% increase are dentistry, which continues to experience high demand and strong earnings potential, so they're proposing a 3% increase, and veterinary medicine on the other end, which is proposing a 0.9% increase in response to its relatively high rate in the market, combined with the challenging earnings potential to debt load mix for the graduates. In the center of this chart, we are proposing a 2% increase in the general graduate program rate, which is for the majority of our graduate programs. Within the tuition rate tables, which are in attachment 6, beginning on page 66 of the docket materials, you will see some fluctuations in some of the other departmental master's programs, which reflect market comparisons or restructuring. Finally, at the top of the chart, you see the proposed increases in the undergraduate rates. In more detail here, this chart reflects the change in the resident undergraduate rates by campus for the last 7 years, or beginning with the first budget recommended by President Kaler. With the 2% increase recommended on the Twin Cities campus, the 1% increase recommended at Morris, and flat rates at Crookston, Duluth, and Rochester, the average annual increase in President Kaler's tenure would be just over 1% on the Twin Cities campus and less than 0.5% on the other campuses. Based on what we understand is planned for next year, for students with the greatest financial need, those eligible for federal Pell Awards or the Minnesota State grants, the $258 increase on the Twin Cities campus and the $126 increase on the Morris campus will be more than offset by a $175 increase in the Pell Awards and an estimated potential increase of $120 in the maximum Minnesota State grant. Moving to the non-resident non-reciprocity, or NRNR rates. At the undergraduate level, the significant change here is one you approved earlier this year, a 15% increase for incoming students to the Twin Cities campus and a corresponding 5.5% increase for continuing students. These changes are estimated to generate incremental revenues of $8.1 million. Throughout the budget development process, units were watching the application information related to this population, and in a number of cases, the tuition revenue estimates we settled on reflect an anticipated reduction in the proportion of their total students that are paying these NRNR rates. As a result, I believe the revenue estimates built into this proposed budget are reasonable, given the potential for final NRNR enrollment numbers to be slightly less than the high numbers we experienced this year. In addition to tuition, this budget includes proposed changes in fees and room and board charges. Tables displaying the, quote, change in tuition fees, room and board, FY18 versus FY19, for each of the 5 campuses begin on page 22 of the docket materials. In the interest of time, I will not walk through each of those tables, but they do provide information on the tuition changes I've just mentioned, plus the proposed changes in required fees and room and board. By campus, the total increase you would be approving with this budget for tuition and fees is less than 2% on all campuses and ranges from an increase of 0.8% to 3% when you factor in the room and board adjustments. Included in those tables and in those percentage increases are the academic fees that are referenced here in the far right box on this slide. These are the campus and collegiate fees required for each enrolled student. And for FY19, we have only 2 recommended increases, a $4 to $6 increase per semester for full-time students at Duluth and a $42 increase for students at Morris. The Morris fee increase is necessary to support costs on the campus, and at $150, which is what per semester, which is what it will be with this recommendation. For a full-time student, it will remain among the lowest academic fees across all the Twin Cities colleges and campuses. As this slide indicates, there are also a variety of course and miscellaneous fees that are charged to students based on their specific registration activity or service requirements. We review these fees extensively each year and have a very robust process that requires a description, a rationale, a connection to the policy, etc., before proceeding with any proposed changes. You can see here that some fees are being eliminated from this year as we move into next year, and of those that remain, 80% will be unchanged. Although not summarized on this slide, the budget also includes the annual recommended changes in the student services fees, which are separate in board policy and involve an intense process of student review, approval, and recommendation on each campus. For FY19, the students recommended no increase at Rochester, but increases in these fees range from 1.2% at Crookston to 3.7% at Morris. In all cases, the portion of the student services fees subject to the new legislation calling for a vote of the full student body for any increase over 2% came in below that threshold, so there will be no required vote. The complete listing of all proposed fees and the change from this year can be found in attachment 8 through 11, beginning on page 75 of the docket materials. Turning to existing university resources as part of the solution, the $28.3 million can be broken down as $9.3 million from these miscellaneous sources on the top here, which includes FY18 tuition coming in over budget that is uncommitted to recurring costs, and $3.1 million of prior allocations to units that can be repurposed to address FY19 incremental costs. And then the largest portion is the $19 million from unit level expenditure reductions that free up existing resources to address higher priority needs. As in past years, this is primarily accomplished through the elimination of positions or salary savings from turnover or restructuring of appointments. Approximately 70% of the actions proposed for next year are in those 2 categories. The remaining 30% reflect reduction in utilities, travel, just general operating expenses. To address the most basic core needs for FY19, including the proposed compensation changes, the required level of reallocation had to exceed the originally planned $15 million. To reach a total of $19 million in just the framework funds, units responded with $8.3 million of planned administrative cost reductions and $6.6 million of direct mission cost reductions. Examples of what they are planning to do are included in the budget beginning on page 25 of the docket materials. In addition, some units have been given an additional reallocation target totaling, and those all total $4.1 million. Due to timing, we do not yet know the specific actions they will take. Some will be administrative, some will be mission, but we will circle back with them in this fall and winter part of the process to find out what they are going to do in response to these additional targets. But even without that knowledge, including only what we have heard from units about definite plans for FY19, we are on track to achieve the President's goal of reallocating $90 million in administrative costs. You've seen this chart many times before. It identifies by year the administrative reductions implemented or planned. At this point, under item 6, you can see the $8.3 million that I just mentioned is coming from the state and tuition funds as part of the FY19 framework. In addition, under item number 7, units have identified an additional $3.3 million of administrative reductions they're planning to implement across all the other funds. With those items on top of what we have already accomplished in previous years, items 1 through 5, we will have implemented administrative spending costs of over $91 million, exceeding the $90 million goal in the timeline originally laid out. For those of us on this 6-year journey, this is definitely good news and I believe noteworthy. Now, turning to the expenditure side of the budget, I want to summarize the incremental spending. We're recommending investments totaling $46.3 million. Consistent with the priority to maintain excellence in the core, 68.4% of the new spending identified in these funds is for the proposed compensation plan, which is for a salary pool increase of 2% plus fringe. And an additional 28.1% of the investment is for either general operating budget support in the units or required infrastructure costs. That is 96.5% of the new spending is for maintaining the core rather than enhancements in program or services. Just a note about what is explained here as an investment. As we've repeatedly said, this budget conversation is focused on our large discretionary funds, roughly 40% of our budget. The other funds of the institution are part of the budget you approve, but we do not detail the myriad of decisions that are made as units work to operate within and maximize the impact of the resources available to them. So you can think about this $46.3 million identified here as the proposals the university is making on how to allocate the discretionary revenue to the institution, the new revenue, in this case tuition, plus proposals made at the highest levels to move existing state funds and tuition between programs within a unit or sometimes between units. Those decisions are what we are explaining here as new investments. The largest investment for FY19 in any fund is for compensation, a total new estimated cost of almost $60 million. Within the framework funds, that will cost us $31.7 million, paid for by a combination of tuition revenue increases and unit level resources. In other funds, it will require an additional expenditure of $27.7 million to be paid for by increases in those corresponding revenues. Could be grants, could be gifts, endowment earnings, etc., and or additional expenditure reductions in those other funds. In all cases, outside of bargaining unit settlements, the plan is for a 2% merit pool to be distributed to individual employees based on decisions within the units related to performance. Outside of compensation, as I've mentioned, unit level operating needs are paramount. Through a combination of what we just described, the internal unit reallocations, tuition revenue growth, and moving state funding between units, we are proposing to invest over $5 million in our largest structural imbalances, $1.8 million in the law school, $1.5 million at UMD, and $1.5 for Crookston and Morris combined. In addition, spread across all other units, there is $3.5 million that will be dedicated to maintaining core operations. These are decisions to allow tuition revenue growth and/or resources from planned internal reallocations to remain in some of those units to support general cost increases or provide a small cushion against potential fluctuations in cost or revenue. The $1 million related to compliance listed here addresses areas such as disability resources, lab, health and safety requirements, EOAA investigators, and so forth. The full list of investments, including those related to technology, facilities, and program or service enhancements, can be seen on attachment 1 to the budget, which is page 41 of the docket materials. In summary, this budget includes a projected increase in total revenues, all funds, of 1.2% and a projected increase in total expenditures of 1.8%. Even if all of these changes are ultimately recurring, the overall budget remains structurally balanced with a projected growth in the ending balance. 75% of the expenditure growth is related to compensation, while spending on all other expense categories is estimated at a 1.2% increase. By all inflationary measures, these changes reflect constraint. The most recent consumer price index is at 2.4%, the higher education price index is at 3.7%, and the personal consumption expenditure index is at 1.9%. With that, Mr. Chair and members, we recommend for approval the President's FY19 annual operating budget and are happy to take questions or participate in the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Associate Vice President Tonneson, for a brief budget overview. You did a terrific job and gave us a lot to work with. So, do we have any questions on the operating budget? Regent Hsu.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thank you, Ms. Tonneson, for the excellent overview. I have a question regarding the, on page 10, page 5 of the handout, page 10 of the presentation. There's the $4 million was uncommitted FY18 tuition over budget. Can you explain kind of where that comes from? And
certainly, Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu. Each year, the units at the beginning of the year plan to spend what we approve as part of the budget as the revenue estimate. During the year, for different colleges, the tuition revenue will come in more or less than what we estimated. There are cases in which the revenue coming in exceeds their budget. It is therefore uncommitted to recurring expenditures that exist this year and is available to spend on recurring expenditures next year. That's what you see here as the 4.1. There are other cases in which that budget surplus, I will call it, in tuition is already committed to expenditures, often associated with costs necessary for generating that revenue. So as enrollment grows, for example, there's costs associated with that. That's not then double spent here in 19. So.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Could you please then go to page 12, page 6 of the handout, page 12 of the presentation. The compensation and benefits, could you kind of give us an idea of how that $31.7 million breaks out? And that's including fringe. It's 20%, 2% plus fringe, is that right? 2%.
Associate Vice President Tonneson, when you find it in your document.
Yes. Mr. Chair, members, yes, that is the salary increase plus fringe. I'm looking for my page because I have it broken out. Hang on.
I can, Mr. Chairman.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Hsu, part of the issue is we have a fringe rate increase even if we did not have a compensation pool. If you recall, we had a refund in years past and the federal government makes us apply that to our fringe rate, so we're weaving out of that money. So even if we had no compensation increase, we were going to have a fringe rate increase we were going to have to cover just to maintain. And so that plus each 1% with its attenuant fringe is how you get to 31.7.
Right. Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu, the 31.7 includes about $18 million of that is salary. About $8 million of it is the fringe that Senior Vice President Burnett just mentioned, in terms of even if there was no salary increase, the increase in fringe costs would have been 8%, 8 million, I'm sorry. And then the rest of it, roughly $5.5 million, is the fringe associated with the higher salary, applying the fringe rate on the higher salaries.
Does that answer your question, Regent Hsu, or do you have a follow-up?
For now it does, thank you.
For now it does. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So just a question for now. It has to do with the income from gifts and endowments. And I think there was a table earlier in the report that sort of highlighted that income over the last 3 years. And it went from in 16-17 from 259 million, then 246, and then in the most recent year 253. You don't have to. I'm pretty sure I'm right on the numbers. I'm not. It's not a quiz on the numbers.
Yep.
It's more.
Yep.
It's more. It more has to do with, it seems like with a building an endowment that is strengthening over time because of all the great campaign activities that we have, and plus the market performance over the last several years. It just seems that would be gradually increasing, and we're still, next year the plot is that we'd still be down $6 or $7 million. So I guess I'm not sure that you can answer the question today, but it would be useful, I think, to understand how we manage the endowment for stability and reliably increasing income. That when we look at the endowment, both here and at UMF, we tend to focus on how we're managing, the asset for stability and growth, which is important. But I'm also interested in, the assumptions we make on what income we can provide for that. And it seems that we are in a position where we could count on an increasing contribution from that pool, and we're not seeing it here in this budget. And if we were even equal to a couple years ago, it'd make a big difference.
Associate Vice President Tonneson, is that something you're prepared to
I can
answer?
make a comment, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Regent Powell, just quickly, what you'll often see in the budget, we show what you mentioned as an actual FY16, actual 17, an estimated 18, and then a projected 19. What you will see in almost every year, the estimated current year amount is based on what units budget, and then we make adjustments to that based on some of the considerations you just mentioned. So, for example, in that line in and of itself, units budgeted actually a larger decrease this year because they are conservative. When they go in and do their budget estimates, you will find that most units are conservative on the revenue side and the expenditure side. They underestimate revenues, overestimate expenditures. So what we do is we look at that, and in this case I actually added quite a bit to the FY18 amount to even get to what you see here. It is still conservative, and then we grow it from there. So,
if I can, quick follow.
Regent Powell.
Just a quick follow-on. So it seems that the endowment income seems like it would be something that would be sort of centrally calculated, but maybe so much of the endowment is directed to specific places that it's actually a decentralized,
Associate Vice President Tonneson, you're nodding your head.
I am, Mr. Chair, Regent Powell. It is actually managed at the unit level in that the funds go directly to the individual colleges and units that it's dedicated or restricted to, and then they actually determine on an annual basis how to spend that, and sometimes how to either to take it and spend it or to reinvest it back in. So there is some decisions being made at the unit level.
Okay.
I think Senior Vice President Burnett wanted to take a stab at that answer also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Regent Powell. The other piece is we smooth out the earnings in these accounts, and it's a look back of the average net asset value. So a good year of investments wouldn't naturally be an incremental increase because we smooth it out, because investments, of course, do this, as you know. So there's also looking back of the average of several quarters back is what is actually paid out from the endowment to the units. So there's no question the current stock market environment, equity environment is promising. promising and moving those up, but we actually try and smooth that out to have a more stable recurring fund stream for these endowed professorships or these endowed scholarships, so that they don't get whipsawed when markets change. And so we can walk you through that policy, and there's one for the UMF and there's one for the endowments, the consolidated endowments that we manage, about the look back and the smoothing.
Okay, thank you. I think it would be worthwhile for the board to see, how we manage and plan and project income off of the endowment at some future time.
Happy to.
I agree with that. And Vice President Tonneson, and then we're going to have the President speak.
I just want to have one clarification too. The line you're looking at does include gifts as well as the endowment earnings, so the endowment earning portion may well be more stable, at least from a budgeting perspective, and units are less inclined to estimate growth in gifts, that's also part of that line.
All right.
President Kaler, did you want to add something to this discussion?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I was going to say exactly what Julie just said, and I will only augment it by the fact that because gifts are unpredictable, it is unwise to budget them, and they also are affected by the timing of the gift. So you may have a big gift in one year and not so much the next, and you think, oh my goodness. So that smooth endowment income is actually quite predictable. It's trailing 12 quarters, and I think our distribution rate is now 4.5%.
That's right.
And so we know essentially exactly what that's likely to be next year, but I can't tell you when the big General Mills gift is going to arrive exactly.
Thank you, President Kaler. Regent Lucas has a question. Go ahead, Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I'm looking at slide 8, I think it is, about the NRNR projections. We had quite a robust discussion about that last time, and I assume you're budgeting for the full number of NRNR people as we hope for. Is that right?
Vice President Tonneson, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, some of the units, as I mentioned, have been watching the application numbers from that population and have gone conservative in terms of their total mix of resident and non-resident. They're planning to make the class the targets for sure, but the mix in some of the colleges is they are budgeting to shift a little bit to be conservative. So the revenue estimates here include some of that shift. So some reduction from the high levels of NRNR. The portion of our students paying the NRNR rate will be slightly less than it was for the current year.
So we've already budgeted for that potential?
Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, the revenue estimates here it's a sum of a unit by unit estimate, and in some of those units, yes, we are estimating a little bit of a less of the population paying the NRNR rate than it is this year. Yes.
Okay.
That's built in. So if the numbers were to come in at target or higher, there will be budget above these estimates.
And if they come in lower, it would be lower? Possible. Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, and that's what we then have to worry about next year when we build the budget. We make up for that. Thank you.
So would it be fair to say that the enrollment office and the different collegiate units are really in contact with each other, seeing where this is coming at? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that is true.
And it's reflected in your budget?
Mr. Chair, that's true.
Okay, thank you. Senior Vice President Burnett want to say something?
I just wanted to echo that. I think, again, this is a very conservatively constructed budget, and we would not estimate that demand couldn't shift in different ways, especially with the pricing change that we've done. So I think, to Associate Vice President Tonneson's point, we've tried to pin those down, and sometimes we're right and sometimes we're not right. The good news that's in this budget this year, that conservative budget brought $4 million of revenue we didn't anticipate that can be applied towards this year's. And so we have a high level of transparency between the units, the collegiate units that earn those revenues, and the central budget office, so that we know where those revenues are both up and down and can put a budget together for you that's as accurate as possible. And as you know, we won't know until census date in September what the final number is when all the tuition payments come in. But again, I applaud the history of this institution, thinking very conservatively about it, and I'd rather have additional revenue next year to work through rather than try and fill some holes that we might not anticipate. So that's been a long-standing effort of the Budget Office and this institution.
Yeah, Regent Lucas. Regent Swigum, you have a question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Vice President Tonneson, I want to compliment you on putting together, I think, a very good budget, and I mean that very sincerely. As sometimes a critic, I think you put together a good budget. I will guarantee you right now that President Kaler will get 99.5% of what he is recommending. Maybe 100%, but at least 99.5%. And in anybody's world, in anybody's ballgame, that would be a very, very big compliment and a big win. Let me just real quickly talk about the tuition revenue that you're anticipating, $18.1 million. We've already approved just about half of that in the NR increase, correct? So it's like 9 or 10 million?
10, Mr. Chair, Regent Swigum, you're right. The non-resident, non-reciprocity estimate is 8.1 out of the 18.1.
Right. Okay.
So there's 10 million from undergraduate resident as well as graduate and professional.
Okay. So just suppose we didn't want to do that. Just think with me for a second. Ways to address it would be, first of all, schools out on what the legislature will or will not give us this year.
Vice President Tonneson.
Mr. Chair, Regent Swigum, yes, I believe that is true.
Okay. So schools out yet, we'll know in 10 days, one way or another. Hopefully, the legislature would see fit to give us the governor's recommendation as a compromise at the end of the session, trying to find common ground. And I can assure you, in talking to a number of legislators, that they think there is some common ground that's there. So that's a possibility. Second possibility of looking at that 10 million would be something that you even talked about in here in some of the various schools or programs, or that I'd mentioned before, would be our employee size. I was surprised to find out that last year we increased our number of employees at the university by 470 people, of which, first of all, I'm going to discard 1/3 of them as being absolutely imperative, because that was due to MnDrive or the basically health counselors, which we had approved as a board. So that's about 1/3. There's still 300 and some folks there, positions, head count, whatever, however you want to term it. I wish I was smart enough, and I tried to work with Brian to be smart enough, but I haven't got there yet, Brian, to use a scalpel and say, this is part of the university's mission, this is not, and we need to eliminate this is not. But I haven't got there. I'm not smart enough yet. Brian hasn't helped me enough. He hasn't educated me enough. So I'm going to push it on him. So absent being able to do that, you take the scalpel and you go to the meat axe, and you say, well, what about a freeze on hiring or a reduction in hiring due to attrition, doing just an attrition thing over the years? Is that at all a realm of a possibility of something we could do and still continue our mission? And say that there are some attrition possibilities out there?
Associate Vice President Tonneson or Senior Vice President Burnett?
Yeah, let me try to take it. There's no question we could consider a hiring freeze. I think that the challenge in all of those come, Regent Swigum, as you and I have talked, is the inevitable exception requests for public safety officers, for faculty to teach more students or the same number of students when you have faculty retire. And as I've said, as we've shown some data for you over the last few weeks, a number of those new positions were in the medical school and the academic health center, and were the result of continued investment by the state in MnDrive, and many were funded by not tuition or state support, funded by research grants and dollars. And so I think, as you and I have talked about the headcount issue here at the university, I think I've argued that it is a little bit different to think about ones that are funded by the O&M or put pressure on tuition and state support, which are generally the education and the operations of our university, and not necessarily look the same way at positions that are funded by other revenue sources, which is a substantial piece of the budget if you go back to the pie chart and you saw how much was red and how much was yellow. You're really talking about those positions that are green. And the further complication, not to make it hard, but the further complication is a number of our faculty are funded by, in part, O&M dollars and in part by their research grants, and then that changes as research grants come and fund a piece of their position and buy out their teaching time, and then that grant goes away and they go back on O&M. And these are all the things that our department chairs and our campuses and our colleges work through. So it's not as simple. It should be simple, but it's just not in a complex organization that's funded this way. And that's the challenge, I think, when you think about a hiring freeze from my perspective, particularly when we have an institution that's growing in students and growing in research dollars and research awards.
Regents Swigum, you have a follow-up?
Just to follow up and to respond, and Brian has been very, very good about working with me and very, very patient. I would have thrown myself out of the tractor in our last conversation. Having said that, I understand the difference of positions, and you and I have agreed to that. And out of the 470 of new positions, 1/3 of them are due to MnDrive, and with MnDrive and the counselor, the health counselors. So take that 1/3 out. There still was over 300. I just have the feeling that it would be a wonderful method. It sounds like a rehash of last year. I'm just that much smarter than last year, and last year I knew nothing about it. But I think we have ability and movement to be able to do our mission, create an efficiency, and maybe not push any further tuition costs onto students. I think it's there. I think we have that opportunity to do it. Again, it's a meat axe rather than a scalpel. Brian, you know I'd rather use a scalpel, but you haven't got me there yet.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Regents Swigum, we agree, and I think the budget recommendation we brought forward reflects they're going to have to reduce positions, and we put this in the docket to come up with $19 million when 60% of your budget is people. There's no way we're going to make those reductions to fund a salary pool without having fewer people. So I guess I would say I'd be happy to work with you and the board. Let's look at it, let's monitor it, but there's also going to be some fairly big efforts that have been underway for quite some time that could change the employment landscape here at the university with respect to clinical partnerships that wouldn't have anything to do with tuition rates or state support. And so I guess what I would say is I think we would be glad to work with you over the course of the next budget cycle to actually look at that and see what attribute that. We agree in principle. I think you just need to know that we're not going to get to $18 million in savings with the same workforce. It's just not going to happen.
Mr. Chairman, again, I understand it's in people. I respect that. I understand that. That's why I talked about attrition programs. But let's work on it now, not the next budget cycle, because that's what I heard a year ago sitting here at this time was the next budget cycle.
You know, Regis Swigum, I'm not too far away from your viewpoint. I will tell you, though, that sitting in this chair this year has given me a chance to have a few more touch points with the budget. And here's a couple things I learned. And you know, if you go talk to the deans, we push the budget down. The administration pushes the budget down to the dean level, lets them make their own decisions in the small unit that they're in, 51 or 52 of those units. I figured out that 23 units plan to eliminate administration positions to meet their reallocation targets. 21 units plan to reallocate funds by reducing staff. And 27 units plan to reallocate funds from their general operators. So I think they're trying. And maybe they can do better. I mean, I'm not the judge of that, but I'm not so far away from you. And I think from working with this group, I see them trying to do that. But I think it's also a system of we don't know. This budget is a little bit in flux in that we don't know what our state allocation will be. We're assuming we're getting nothing extra. But I'm not so far from you, but I do think the people, you go talk to the deans, I've asked them, they find it pretty hard to make any more cuts. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's my answer, but I'll let you finish.
I'm fine. It'll take too much time. And I don't disagree, Chairman Anderson, with anything you said. And they're willing to work. And I started with a great compliment to the budget.
Yep.
But sometimes just a little bit more makes me a little bit happier.
All of us, we want to do the best we can for the state of Minnesota, so I take it as constructive. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Associate Vice President Tonneson. And I want to key off Regent Svigum's comments. I think it's helpful to have the information that he's asked for in terms of where exactly were these new hires deployed. And I think in addition to those that came out of MnDrive related projects and the mental health counselors, there's a cohort, and maybe some of these are included in the MnDrive, that come out of the medical school investment. And remember, colleagues, we made the decision to ask the state for dollars, operating dollars, to help resuscitate our research operation there. And we didn't get that fully funded, but we got enough to hire great doctors and producers, but they need teams and they need investments. So I think when we look at the total number of people, we need to exclude the medical school group, that new cohort, because those are, in my mind, the most strategic as it relates to our strategic plan. The other thing, I mean, it is a little bit of a repeat from last year. This is the 8th or 9th year in a row of tuition increases that are, at or below inflation, 2%. I know I'm in a minority when I say this, but I have to say it for the record that I would vote for appropriating more money on the investment side, because I think we're squandering an opportunity to take advantage of the retrenchment that our neighboring states are going through as a way to leapfrog this university. If we really want the excellence that we talk about, that does require more dollars. Some of it has to be new money. So when I look at the investment side in the budget, $10 million, $12 million in core operations, that's not very much money for this institution. I mean, it's just really not. And if we don't get fully funded for HEAPR or the capital side, that's underfunding too. So I really look at this as a marketplace opportunity for us to move up another notch or two on the research side. We're doing well with setting the table in the medical school, but they do need resources. So thank you, Regent Svigum, for drilling down. I think we need to keep on top of that metric that he's been so focused on. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. Invariably, when you signal in, you want to talk about one topic and 3 more topics come in before you get there, and you want to talk about those things too. So first I'll ask a question, and I think we're in a time where we're asking questions and maybe making comments at the same time, Mr. Chair. Vice President Tonneson, if we go to page 94, I just want to understand a little bit, this is on student fees. And when you look at it across the campuses, there's a pretty wide range. And I think there's probably a pretty simple explanation that would cover some of the big gap. But I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, why there's a major variation, and then I may have a comment after that.
Mr. Chair, Regent Rocha, the details are, for anyone who is interested, the details are provided in the pages following that, so starting on page 94 of the docket materials. Just generally, though, to remind the board where these come from, they are processes on each campus where they allow student groups to propose budgets that are kind of outside of the university budget and operate just for that student group, and the students choose to increase their fees on themselves for those student groups. That provides a lot of the difference between the campuses and how they do that. The other pieces are more administrative and depends upon the history, quite frankly, of what's been included in the fee over time and what the students have agreed to fund as in terms of administration. So for example, on this campus, the students are partially funding through this process things like the Recwell and Boynton and the student unions. They do that at different levels on different campuses depending on their history and what, just on what their process develops. So it really is those two things, I think, how many student groups they have and the process to generate those fee increases, and then the administrative side in what they have been asked and have agreed to fund as part of their process.
Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, so there, I recognize that the specifics are on the pages after. I was kind of, you answered my inquiry exactly, which is that there are different processes, and so you end up with kind of different priorities, different programs developed over time. Here's the challenge with that. And maybe this kind of comes back a little bit to some of the premises that Regent Sviggum talked about as far as the must-haves. And we certainly wouldn't sit around this board and say we would have anybody on any of our campuses not have something that's essential to their education, right? We wouldn't say we value the students at the University of Minnesota Rochester less than the students at Morris or the Twin Cities. Therefore, we're going to give them a lesser experience, and so their fee is only $168. And to some extent, I want to be sensitive to the fact that we want students to be part of this development, but at the same time, they're also imposing costs on people who really may or may not have any interest in the things that they're having to then pay for over the course of 8 semesters or more through an undergraduate career. And these are real numbers. I recall double-digit numbers for student service fees when I was in school, and that was not that long ago. And now where people will have thousands of dollars in debt if they're borrowing the full cost of their education. And so it may be something that's worth a conversation as to what extent we do shift those costs to students who may or may not be participants in those processes. And there are all kinds of questions about student participation in voting and everything else as to whether it's taxation with representation or without. But nonetheless, it is a real issue, especially for people that fall into those gaps. From a cost standpoint, I appreciate again the questions that Regent Sviggum raised. Regent Beeson makes good points about the need to make the investments to stay in that competitive realm. But I also don't see us as necessarily being a passive actor in terms of what the marketplace across the nation is. We are very much a participant in that, and for having a fairly long worldview about higher education, I can see where it's important that institutions like the University of Minnesota, which is a national leader in terms of what we produce, but also being a national leader in retaining the trust of the public and control of the cost of higher education and our industry generally. President Kaler stepped out, but I wanted to, I'll talk about the next point, and if he happens to roll back in, otherwise I'll do it in absentia for him. With respect to the tuition question, I want to touch on what Regent Anderson talked about when you said that the deans are working on these issues, and they're trying, and they've got positions to eliminate. I'm still having a hard time understanding what our cost cutting has been, because my observation over time has been that it has been reallocation as opposed to elimination of expenses. And so that, to me, that's a little bit different as far as our ability to represent to legislative funders or to the general public that we are being conservative about the way we expend resources. And even within those departments, I would estimate that you may be eliminating this position, but those functions are falling to other parties, or there may be other employees coming in a different way. It's hard for me to address that in the abstract. However, I will say this. When our administration is dealing with a position elimination here or a position reclassification there, those are six-figure problems, right? I mean, sometimes high six-figure problems. The resources are substantial. The dollar amounts for these salaries are substantial. When students are trying to come up with that additional few $100s a semester, for a lot of them, especially those that are above the levels where they get the public support, but below the levels or lacking the access from home, those are ramen noodle problems, trying to figure out how they're going to stay in school and balance work, maybe their own family obligations. And so when I look from an equitable perspective, I'm comfortable with having to constantly, as servants of the public at the University of Minnesota, to constantly be looking at ways of being efficient, delivering excellence with an eye toward preserving the resources that were provided, whether it's through philanthropy, tuition, or state appropriations. I will move to my last comment that was for the president, and that I appreciate that he has talked about one of the hallmarks of his administration has been minimizing tuition over time, and as we saw, over the years, it was 1% per year otherwise. This is where the rubber hits the road. Much of that preservation of the tuition rate has come from directives where the legislature has provided funds for the very purpose of keeping tuition low. Keeping tuition low when it takes work in this regard is what lets you say that holding the cost for students is a hallmark of the administration. If it's simply because other things have come along that have led us to the point where we've kept it flat, then it's sort of a coincidence of the administration. To make it a hallmark, I think this is an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we are fully committed to that in holding the line on tuition. I also think, dovetailing off of Regent Svigum's comments, if we do that, I think we would demonstrate a fidelity to the concept that may invite the legislature to be more forthcoming with resources to the institution to allow us to make it affordable for residents of the state to attend their land-grant university. And so I would like to see us be even more assertive and make it truly a hallmark of this time that we are going to put in the effort necessary to hold the line on tuition. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Lucas, we've got about 5 minutes left, so.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I am channeling Regent Omari on this one. So what he asked me to ask is, could we ask within the reallocation of positions being eliminated, how many are student jobs?
Do you have that answer, Associate
Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, I do not have that. We can get that information for you. I don't recall it being actually a major proposal from any unit, but we will check on that.
If I can answer.
Senior Vice President Burnett may have an answer.
Here's what I would say, Regent Lucas. I wouldn't ever say that there wasn't a student job eliminated to have. I think you should judge the administration as, is student employment going up and overall? Because I think some units might trim and some units might add. So I think the way that you should look at it from the governing board perspective is, are we committed to student employment? The answer is yes. It's a great way to help them pay for their costs, but I think that some units might have to make some hard costs, and I just don't think you can put those types of constraints on deans or department chairs that they can't do that when other parts of the institution might be hiring a number of students. So I think we should just, I think I would, if Regent Omari was here, I would just say that I think you should judge us based on the number of student workers total, not just whether one was cut here or two were added here.
So the answer is we're committed to.
We spend a great deal of money. We can get you the number for the June budget meeting of how much we spend on student employment, and it's not inconsequential. And it's important to how we run the institution, particularly student fee areas like RecWell and others. That those are very important to how we run this institution. So we'll bring the numbers that we're doing, but I think it's a bigger picture from a budget perspective. Are we committed to student employment rather than did one job get lost here or we're added here?
Thank you. Regent Cohen.
Maybe if it's just 5 minutes left, I'll get the last word.
You get the last word. That's exactly right.
But I want to underscore what Regent Beeson said, and perhaps we're in the minority, but I really hope not. I do think it's a time where we can guard and improve our excellence and invest in what this board has decided is their top priority, the medical school and other areas. We need to be back in the top 20 of medical schools. We have a new dean, we have great opportunity, we may have some alliances. To me, 0.4% average tuition raise over 7 years is phenomenal. It's being very acutely tuned in to what we're doing for the students in Minnesota. Whereas before that, there were double digits, 10, 12, 14% increases. So I think a 0.4 average of tuition increase for our Minnesota students, as I said, is phenomenal. And I think it's our chance to really improve the excellence of the university.
Thank you, Regent Cohen. You know, that takes up our hour. I want to thank you. I think we've heard from both sides of the aisle on everything. We've got a lot of work to do in the next month to get to a place where we'll be. But I think at this time we're going to let Vice President Tonneson stay seated, I guess, and Provost Hanson and Dean Jenkins are going to come up with you. Okay. So I don't know exactly how you're starting or who's talking. Is it Provost Hanson? You're welcome to have the floor when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair Anderson and members of the committee. I am pleased to introduce Law School Dean Gary Jenkins in a moment, who will provide brief contextual remarks. But prior to his comments on the slides that are specific to the law school's financial situation and solution, I just wanted to make a couple of points. The basic argument I want to make is that we have a great law school, and while it and we absolutely have to deal with a significant financial problem, our fiduciary responsibility here is complex. If we can, and Julie and Brian suggest that we can, we need to fix the financial problem in a way that doesn't jettison an important high-quality component of our university. We have to balance our budget, but the mission of the university is not the budget. The mission is teaching, research, and service. Our excellent law faculty are shaping law through their research, teaching, and service, and they're working on issues connected with racial justice, how to reform banking law, how to protect data. Our law school has built up a great reputation over 130 years to become one of the most well-regarded public law schools in the United States. It is in the top 20. These have definitely been challenging times for all law schools, but ours continues to embody excellence and advance the reputation and mission of the university. Substantial progress has been made on the vexing economic issues in the short time since Dean Jenkins' arrival less than 2 years ago, and there have been genuinely new mechanisms implemented to deal with the external circumstances facing all law schools. So as a reminder about the elements of mission, in research and discovery, law school faculty regularly win for the University of Minnesota prestigious awards for their scholarly contributions, and they're well regarded by their peers, not just on this campus, but around the country. But they are well regarded by our peers, and our law faculty are well integrated into the directions of the campus. For example, 6 law school faculty have been awarded Grand Challenges research grants, working on interdisciplinary teams with faculty from the School of Medicine, from Humphrey, Carlson, Global Studies, and Economics, just to name a few. Professor Heidi Kittrosser received a prestigious Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship this academic year to pursue her research on the law and policy of information leaking and whistleblowing among government employees. Professor Daniel Schwartz won the American Law Institute's major prize, the Early Career Medal, which is awarded every other year to recognize just 1 or 2 outstanding professors in the U.S. for the real-world public policy significance of their work and their contributions to the improvement in the law. In teaching and learning, the faculty of the law school are not only engaged scholars, but committed teachers. In fact, 2 of the 8 winners of the 2018 University of Minnesota Award for Outstanding Contributions to Graduate and Professional Education this year are law school faculty members, and that's way out of proportion to their numbers among graduate and professional educators on this campus. Our law students routinely receive national recognition for their work. For example, students from the law school have won the Burton Award 3 out of the last 4 years. The Burton is run in conjunction with the Library of Congress, and it is the most distinguished award in student legal writing. Minnesota now ranks 3rd in the country in total Burton winners. The International Moot Court team recently won the Harish International Moot Court competition in Mumbai, India, besting a global field of 24 teams from the US, the UK, Australia, and Asia. In outreach and public service, the law school's contribution to our region, our nation, and our world are numerous. Our nationally ranked clinical program assists hundreds of clients a year, from asylum seekers to startup companies in the Twin Cities. Fanula Neolin, a University Regents professor and director of the Human Rights Center, was recently appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Kristen Hickman, a distinguished McKnight University professor, was recently named Special Advisor to the Administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Trump administration. That's the federal authority charged with reviewing all executive branch regulations. We have a great faculty and we have great students. So the law school is facing financial problems. Law schools throughout the country are all facing the same financial challenges because of the drastic changes in the legal education market. Believe me, it is on the minds of provosts. At the Big Ten Academic Alliance, every year we have a check-in about the law schools. And many people are looking for different kinds of solutions. But I want to say that under Dean Jenkins' leadership, and with the very strong help of the Budget Office, the law school is finally making strides to maximize revenue and control costs while maintaining the quality and reputation of the school. And that is an integral part of our university's identity. The strategic investment plan developed by the Budget Office and the law school is smart and responsible. It builds on the law school's positive momentum under Gary's leadership, and it positions the university and the law school for long-term success. In admissions this year, the law school enrolled its largest class in 4 years while maintaining student quality. In employment, it continues to provide the talent that the state needs. Nearly 75% of the judicial clerks on the Supreme Court of Minnesota next year are Minnesota law grads. And on the advancement or the fundraising front, the law school is doing extremely well. It's among the leaders among all units in its progress toward its goals in the university-wide Driven campaign. And that all the deans met last night, and they just kept talking about Gary's $25 million from the Robina Foundation. But Dean Jenkins is paying attention to all of those elements, again, including the need to balance the budget. I'm not again saying that we need to do that, but let's not forget what an asset it is.
Thank you, Provost Hanson. Dean Jenkins, are you going next?
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the board and Provost Hanson. I'm happy to talk about what's happening in legal education and to our law school and our plan forward. For a long time, including through the first decade of the 2000s, law school admissions was booming. Strong schools like ours could attract highly qualified students without offering significant scholarships, while at the same time, tuition rates steadily increased significantly, about, for example, 159% in resident tuition increase from fiscal year 2000 to 2010. This was when the O&M allocation for the law school was set, and as a result, essentially not much was needed. But in response to the after effects of the Great Recession and the changes in the legal market, and a dramatic market contraction occurred in the number of applications for law students, and that set off substantial change in the legal education marketplace. And as the market shrank about 40%, schools had to compete for qualified students, which in supply and demand terms meant that students began to expect to demand substantially larger and larger scholarships. And the smaller pool meant that most schools had to reduce the incoming class size to maintain student quality. And as a result, our law school was not immune to those market forces that were at work. Now, thankfully, the market has begun to stabilize with modest signs of improvement, and you can see in the chart 2018 numbers are starting to have our first real uptick. But of course, experts forecast that only modest continued increases here. So in other words, what we have is a law school economic model that has permanently changed. And with Minnesota enrolling fewer students and as a result receiving less net tuition per student, a structural imbalance arose. And this was larger than what might have been experienced by other units because of this extreme national market shift that has occurred. And in fact, our law school in particular had a historically higher reliance on tuition, which meant that it didn't need as much O&M support for many years. Now, the school has made substantial inroads in reducing its structural imbalance. Since 2014, the law school has actually reduced recurring expenditures by more than $6.2 million through the eliminating of faculty positions, the elimination of staff position, reducing faculty salaries, eliminating other costs and programs that were operating expenses, and we have another $500,000 in further reductions for the next fiscal year. But despite those efforts, the problem persisted, largely because we were simply in such a dramatically different legal education market and situation, and our O&M allocation was based on a market that simply no longer existed. In February of 2016, my predecessor provided an update to the Board of Regents on the structural imbalance and non-recurring year-end transfers, and he projected that there would be no more transfers by 2020. So why haven't those held? Well, like all projections, they were based on a set of assumptions, and some of which required institutional actions and others that were determined by the market. And it was that latter set of assumptions, the market ones, that did not hold because of JD and transfer admissions hadn't yet reached the point of stability. And in fact, they fell further still from that point. Now, I'm pleased to report that we're executing now today on a number of strategic imperatives and interventions and taking a series of affirmative steps to bend the curve in our favor. And we've been doing this. We've been seeing success. We've been seeing signs of recovery in the fuller national market, which is exciting for us. On the admissions and enrollment side, we've introduced a number of new strategies and efforts in this area, changed some practices after careful data analysis, which led to our largest entering class in 4 years this past fall. And I expect that this coming fall will exceed that number. We also were able to increase applications this year. We saw a 10% increase compared to a national average of 7.5. Our yield on admitted students went up last year 15% for the class that entered fall of 2017, and we're on track this year for a further increase in yield that may even be as high as double that. And this is all while maintaining the quality of the entering class as measured by the academic credentials that we track and that we care about. On bar passage, we've implemented some new efforts there. We saw an increase up from 86% upon my arrival to 91% in last July's test, which now means there's a 13-point spread on the Minnesota bar in pass rate between U of M takers and all others combined. On employment, our strategic efforts here, including new public service programming and other changes, have led to an 18% increase in permanent full-time employment at 10 months after graduation, from about 73% when I arrived to about 90% now. strategic philanthropy. We've aligned our capital campaign with fiscal needs and strategic priorities so that we're focusing on things that will help us attract students, that will retain and support faculty, support curricular innovation, and financial aid. We've had a successful launch and high engagement and positive momentum, and we're achieving some record highs in both total gifts and in annual fund contributions. And of course, we've been doing this with conservative fiscal management. We've engaged in staff restructuring to save costs. 13 faculty lines, 18.5 staff positions have been eliminated. We're utilizing shared services. We now have some joint positions with Carlson, for example. We're holding down salary increases for cost avoidance. This year, again, we're going to award smaller than the university authorized increase. So that's going to make 4 of the past 5 years where the law school will have awarded 0 or something smaller than the university authorized amount in salary increases. So all that being said, we're seeing success. We're seeing some green shoots in the market, but this plan is a critical part of our pathway out. As the provost mentioned, in October, she established a joint finance oversight committee that included members from Central, our colleagues from Budget and Finance, some colleagues from the Provost Office and from the law school together to analyze the structural imbalance, to develop solutions. And after extensive baselining, the committee identified 3 strategies that merited exploration: lowering standards, investing in improving reputation and ranking, and maintaining quality and reputation. And the financial impact of each strategy was modeled from fiscal year 19 through 23, taking a comprehensive view of how the strategy would impact total revenues and expenditures. And under strategy 2 in the appendix, which is red on the slide, the law school would offer less competitive scholarships, would take lower credentialed students. Essentially, it would seek to increase revenue by increasing the student population at the expense of quality and reputation. Yet, through our collective analysis, including some actual case studies, we determined that because of what's happening in the law school market is systemic and affecting institutions at all levels, such a move wasn't sustainable and would place us in a position where we would actually be less able to capture the tuition revenue that we would need to support operations. So it was not going to help our financial problems, and in fact would actually exacerbate them. Strategy 3 in the appendix, that's in the yellow on the slide, the law school would seek to increase reputation, increase its market position through additional investment in the academic program. But here we determined that the cost did not provide the kind of return that would turn around the financial fortunes in the timeline that we were looking to do, and led to a decrease in net revenue. And under what we called strategy number 1, in the green on the slide, which was the best, the law school would continue to maintain our tradition of quality while modestly increasing class size, all with a laser focus on constraining costs. And this path, this approach, which includes a rebasing of O&M, would preserve the gains that we've made in recent years of strong success and enable us to maintain academic excellence and maximize student outcomes and a tuition premium for that excellence and get back on a fiscally sustainable path. In terms of the effects of the long-term net tuition revenue, I think some of those results were a little surprising to some members of the committee based on maybe their initial instincts or hypotheses. But actually, it turned out to be consistent with the fact that really what's happened is this admissions financial markets for law school has really changed, law schools nationally has changed so significantly significantly. The models demonstrated that lowering standards would put the law school in a worse financial position, actually even worse relative, not just to these other options, but relative to where we are now, where we currently sit. So I think the analogy that I've used is, as in business, when the market is tight, that's a really bad time to weaken your product. And adopting a strategy of lowering standards for larger classes in an attempt to maximize revenue in our circumstance ultimately led to less net tuition revenue. And as the appendix describes, this result follows from how changes in student quality affect reputation, including the highly influential U.S. News rankings, and how a drop impacts a school's ability to recruit students in future years. So because student quality, for us largely measured, not exclusively, but for U.S. News purposes by LSAT, the entering exam for prospective students and undergraduate GPA. Those are key components of the ranking. If a school adopts a strategy of recruiting lower credentialed students, then the metrics decline. And in turn, the rankings drop significantly. And once that happens, you have a predictable set of experiences that occur that leads to fewer JD applications, that increase financial aid, than to recruit lower quality students. Then you experience bar passage problems, fewer employment opportunities for graduate. You lose notable faculty, and that impacts the reputation among academic and professional peers, both of which are factors in the U.S. News ranking itself. So it creates this kind of cycle. And as a result, the scholarship increase, the financial aid scholarship increases once the rankings drop. Essentially, especially for a school like ours that has set baseline tuition consistent with our traditionally higher rank as a top 20 school, a move down would actually exacerbate that problem. So that's why we refer to this as the downward spiral. So this means that any first-year short-term revenue gains by adopting this strategy are short-lived ones. And very quickly, because in part that we're in a market and current tuition levels, as they drop, cause more discounting that weakens the institutional financial model over the long term. So that's why ultimately it was the strategy of maintaining quality and reputation that enabled us to develop a plan that led to an increase, $1.8 million in net tuition revenue. So based on the committee's work, the president's recommendation, and included in the budget, in solving this imbalance over 3 years, will require additional recurring O&M allocations in 19 through 21, and a year-end transfer only in fiscal year 19. The law school has already made, I think, considerable strides towards reducing expenditures and controlling costs, as I mentioned earlier, or more than $6.7 million, and this rebasing of our O&M level would be combined with further internal reallocations above the university targets through continued cost-cutting tactics, shared services like we've started to do, and other revenue enhancements. So this process will be an ongoing one. We've all agreed that this committee will continue to work together to monitor progress and make adjustments as the law school pursues our ongoing strategic tactics so that we can meet the shared goals that we all have, which are financial stability, institutional success, and academic excellence.
Thank you, Dean Jenkins. We all had I think we had some more slides in our packet and things too that you probably went through. I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions they want to ask. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that report. I would like to talk about a couple of things because this is obviously as one of the alumni of this college on this board, something that I have thought a lot about since coming back. And I want to be productive in the conversation and make sure that I say things in a way that will not jeopardize the warmth I receive at the commencement on Saturday. If we can go back to page 20, if you would. I'm kind of surprised that you didn't put a picture of Mr. Yuck by the top option up there, just to make sure that we are clear that the red is intended to show that this is not a favored option. When earlier in your conversation you talked about qualified applicants, when really we're talking about highly ranked, I think, academic applicants. My expectation is we can suggest that that there are certain indicia that would identify students most likely to pass the bar first time around, and we obviously want to identify students that are going to be successful in that regard, but also for the experience of our faculty, they want engaged and strong students. That we hear that across our undergraduate population question and so on as well. But within this, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the logic of the decrease from the first option, to the extent that if you have more people paying more money, that it produces less revenue. And I know that it shows this cycle starting off of U.S. News, which always causes alarm to me when we talk about a ranking of that variety, which, as we know, has certain bias considerations as well. Where you'd run into a problem is where we're no longer getting 2,000 applicants for a couple hundred slots, but we're getting 140 applicants for 200 slots. That's when you're really going to have a hard time ensuring that you're filling seats. Granted, out of that 2,000, not all of that 2,000 would be people you would identify as likely to succeed in the law school environment. But my understanding is that across the country there are other public institutions, particularly those that don't have the kind of support that the University of Minnesota receives from its state. There are institutions that decided not to go this route, not to continue to reduce the class size in order to maintain the average of the qualifications of its students. And some of those have had corresponding slides in their ranking. Some of them more dramatic than others. But if you could speak to that concept, the schools that have been normally with us. I think we have a neighbor relatively close to us that has gone that route. And these are schools that have typically been in sort of that top 25 law schools, upper quartile schools to be sure. And what has happened with those institutions? And then I have another question after that, Mr. Chair.
Dean Jenkins, can you speak to that?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman and Regent Rocha, thank you. And of course, I look forward to welcoming you Saturday at our commencement. What's happened to some of the institutions that have experienced a decline has been part of the reasons that we've had to put this area, this solution in red. That it's been one that has actually not been successful for those institutions. In the appendix that was provided, Figure 12 provides 2 case studies of law schools that experienced a significant drop in the rankings, and what they saw was that their enrollment actually declined and that their scholarship rates went up, in some cases quite significantly. And net revenue per student also declined. So what's happening is that the pressures that institutions are experiencing, they're happening all throughout the law schools. So once you move to a new band, so to speak, the same competitive pressures exist there as they did before. And then in addition, if you look at Figure 13, what you'll see is that the tuition and fees that are actually taken by the university after adjusting for scholarships are actually what I would describe as banded or connected to the ranking. So as the ranking goes down because of the lower credentialed students, those credentials are a factor in the ranking, the amount of tuition or the tuition premium that one can capture actually declines, and that's reflected in figure 13. For us, you mentioned some of our neighboring states. One of our great strengths is the fact that we have students coming from our neighboring states who have very fine law schools, but we're ranked a little higher. And so figure 14 in the appendix shows our neighbors in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, and Wisconsin all have public law schools that are ranked roughly 27 to 37, but 34% of our students are coming from those states. They're choosing not to go to those states, all of whom have lower tuition than we do. They're choosing to come here. And that's in part because of the quality of students that we have, the quality of the education, and what they feel is the reputation and rank that we have. So we don't want to risk that. We don't want to put that at risk.
You got to follow up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that response. I'm going to have to do a little more research, I think. Because part of the concern is also in terms of just sort of the economic effect, and how are we paying for this premium? Because I think I'm always very nervous to talk about the credentials of these students as opposed to sort of the rankings by these, whether it's the LSAT or otherwise. If you can you go to the slide that has the circle? It has, yeah, there. So one of the, just make a couple comments and then I know others wanted to chime in. But so we talk about this spiral. I think we've got a different spiral going on. When you talk about making your way all the way over to the notable faculty, and it says lose notable faculty. It's a challenge if you're saying that you don't want to lose notable faculty, but if the notable faculty aren't drawing the students that get you the rankings, I don't know what that premium provides you. And back, wasn't that many decades ago, just a couple, where attending the University of Minnesota Law School was an amazing scholarship because it was a lot less expensive than the other law schools in the marketplace. I don't think that differential is so great anymore in terms of what the tuition cost is. And this is what I'm kind of concerned about, this sort of death spiral where it's like as we shrink the classes, we need to generate more revenue, so we raise more tuition, which makes us less attractive by comparison to other schools that may be less expensive, and then which means you need to shrink it even further and further to get to the point where you can continue to hold on to that rank based on a very small, eventually you're down to one student who does it really well on the LSAT. I mean, that's not where we want to go. I'm just really concerned that when when the institution has to subsidize a unit to maintain a ranking which some might suggest is a bit artificial, that you create disincentives for that unit to do the things that it has to do to ensure that it remains competitive for the right reasons. If you've got 100 students in a class and you need 110 to balance your budget, adding 10 more students doesn't make the first 100 any less qualified, right? I mean, and so you'd have to say that those last 10 students are just simply so unqualified that they don't belong in your school. But otherwise, if you're going to say, well, we're not going to take those 10 students to balance our budget, well, who's paying for it? And if you continue to shrink the class in order to maintain a ranking, it's a little bit like buying a trophy, right? We need to go out and earn these students to balance our budget so that we're not asking some undergraduate from Cokato to subsidize one of our professional schools. So, as you can tell, I have some real strong questions about how we achieve this. And I also want to just put out a little caution as we go forward. The new entrant into the law school market in Minnesota, St. Thomas, has got a tremendous resource base to build off of. And I think at some point as we go forward in this, we have to even have a conversation about how are we going to position ourselves as a world, as a continuing to be a world class, because we clearly are. We're a top 20 law school. There's no question. We're fantastic. How do we maintain that in a world where the finances have to be supporting that program by itself, while you're competing with what is now a growing juggernaut in our own backyard? So I care deeply about the school. I want to see it succeed as much as anybody could. I'm just concerned that a strategy that allows us to hit the easy button for ranking by just continuing to shrink the class takes away some of the incentives that we need to focus on. And I know this is certainly not your doing, and I appreciate that you've done amazing things already to help us deal with some of these structural problems. And anything that the board can do to support you in that, I'd be right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thank you, Dean Jenkins, and the rest of the team for this sobering and much needed and timely look at what we're up against here. My perspective on the law school is one of fondness and sympathy for the plight they're in, and I come at it now having already had one significant opportunity when your predecessor presented to us, and I really appreciated the slide that took me back to that, because when we talk about structural imbalances, it's helpful to really know if they're truly structural and the things that are driving them are things that have happened within our window of opportunity to understand and see and act on them, and this is one that is. There's other units that have issues that date back decades, and I don't find those characteristics of structural as fair, but this one is fair, and the only way we can deal with it is to every couple of years chop through it and see where we stand. So thank you for that. I understand a downward spiral. I'm probably somewhere close to where Regent Rocha is. I think that perhaps the connections between the loops in the spiral are not perhaps as consequential or certain as you believe they are, but they are real. And I do think that once you start down that path, it can be very tricky to extract yourself from making the clockwise all the way around and finding yourself the year after in a worse place. But I do think there's a few off ramps and some ways that we might be able to deal with that. So the bottom line for me is the cost of this subsidy, and this is where Regent Rocha was landing a few moments ago, is beginning to get to the point where it's too painful for other elements of the university to continue to bear. And while I'm supportive of your green path, and then the slide after that starts to quantify that for us with 1.9, 1.7, 1.5, 1.3 for the next 4 years, I'm not ready to commit to that without hardwiring in some goals and some requirements relative perhaps to class size, to cost reductions on your part, so that we have an opportunity every year to come back and look and see if those are happening, and if they're not, we got to reevaluate. So I'm in for the short run because I care deeply about this problem, but I'm not ready to commit to 4 more years and checking back in 2020 and saying, just like we did with your predecessor in June in 2016, that's too long and the costs are too great. Now, as we bring a system-wide strategic plan in front of the board, this will enter into that conversation too. But in short, I'm in for a little bit longer, but not much. I'll leave it at that.
Dean Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Regent McMillan. I just want to say that part of this proposal and what the President has made crystal clear is that that we're looking for permanent solutions here, and that's why the Provost formed this committee. That's why we've made it clear that cost cutting is an essential piece of the plan, that we have put forward and included that in the proposal, and that the committee is going to continue to monitor this on an annual basis increases. So this is not the committee disband, the work is done. The committee continues to monitor what we're doing. We have no plans to shrink the class. In fact, the proposal includes expanding the class. As part of the proposal was to increase the class. So we have been very clear that we want to be we're part of this great university. We want the whole university to thrive. We're linked arms with the other units is the way that I look at it. And so we've been having frank conversations, but analytical conversations, looking at data, trying to find a strategy forward. And I guess the only other thing that I'd like to note is that in Figure 7 of the appendix, it indicates where our state support stands compared to some of our peer institutions, and the baseline amount as a percent is smaller. It's on the bottom half of that group in the top 30, and the ones that are higher, I'll note, have much larger endowment, some 3 to 5 times more endowment, and so. In terms of where the support, what we're dealing with is a change from past practice, which I think some could argue, one might argue, was a low amount to begin with as a baseline.
Thank you, Dean Jenkins. We have a few more people that do want to comment. This is important stuff, so we're going to try to get to them and run through them, and we're going to run a little late, but I apologize for that. Regis Shue.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. If you've been around campus and you've heard that Regent Shue's been crying about the law school, it's true. I've been crying about it for years. But this is why. A couple years ago, I think it was for the February 16 meeting, your predecessor, Dean Whitman, came to us and told us this would be done by, if we just kind of stayed the course, the market will come back on law grads and we'll be done by 2020, right? Well, I didn't see it in the presentation, but I calculated how much we're into the law school to date, including additional O&M dollars, year-end transfers, etc. And I think that number is close to 40 million. Maybe a little bit less, because I think maybe there was an estimated number. These are your numbers, not my numbers. Estimated numbers for the current year-end deficit. But I think your year-end deficit this year is actually down a little bit, so it's maybe not quite 40 million. But if I look at what you've got going here on this slide, what you're really saying is you need another 1.7 in FY19, and then in FY20 you're going to need that same 1.7 plus another 1.5. And then in 2021, you're going to need the 1.7, the 1.5, and the 1.3, which add up to 10.2 million. And that's not including the FY19 estimated year-end transfer of 1.9, which would bring us up to 12.2 million. So this is really a $12.2 million decision. Now, all the other stuff, let's just say it's a sunk cost and we can't do anything about it. But to answer your questions, Regent Rocha, Regent McMillan, we've made up that money, the $40 million, somewhere, and it has been on tuition increases over the past years, somehow. And if you want to figure it out, you can just divide the number of students, undergraduates or whatever number you want to use. If you use undergraduates, if every undergraduate put in $1,000, that's $30 million, I think. And so, that's a lot of money to put on the backs of undergraduates. Now, I understand we want to have a world-class law school in the Twin Cities to help serve the region. Obviously, we want to have graduates, working in the top legal jobs in the state of Minnesota. But the question is, how do we allocate the resources going forward? We have other campuses that need money. We've got probably other professional schools that could use money. The medical school needs money. And so I'm just trying to understand where we're headed here, and I think we've got a lot to chew on today. And if my numbers are wrong, please let me know. Actually, if my math is wrong, because I'm using your numbers. So I think we're, you know, and the question I have on this page is, are you saying in this plan that we will no longer need to have year-end transfers after FY19?
Dean Jenkins.
Yes, on year-end transfers, yes. That is, Mr. Chairman and Regent Chu, that is the plan that we've developed, yes.
Okay.
If I can also...
Senior Vice President Burnett has an answer.
So one piece of this slide, Regent Chu, just for clarification, these would be incremental recurring dollars. Yes, you can add them up, but this would add by fiscal year 21, those would be $4.5 million of additional O&M from the institution, because that's the increment. It's not $10 million, it's $4.5 million. We just can't get there overnight with the constraints on our budget, nor should we, and we've got work to do to get it within this number. So it's the 1.7 becomes 3.2 in 20, becomes 4.5 in 21. That's the multi-year plan we've put forth for your consideration.
Yeah, and that adds up to 12.2 million.
You can add it in that, but in budgeting from year, it's a recurring.
If I don't add it, what do I do with it?
It's a recurring.
Right. So it means it's got to come from somewhere in future years.
Correct.
Which is either tuition increases or O&M increases.
Correct.
You know, or other places that we haven't even thought of yet. But the fact is, this is a $12.2 million plan that goes out 3 years. In addition to the close to 40 that we had before. So it's a $50 million plan to make sure that our law school stays in the top 20. And don't get me wrong, I want to be in the top 20. I'd rather be in the top 10 if we could pull it off. But the question is, at what cost? So I think we'll have further discussions about this. But I do think this has to be part of our strategic plan in terms of where the resources are going to come from for the law school and for all the other units that also need money.
Associate Vice President Tonneson, do you have something to add here?
Mr. Chair, you were looking a little confused on the numbers. I just wanted to clarify there are two different ways to look at any investment, not just the law school. You could pick any investment that we do on a recurring basis in the budget, pick a year and calculate a cumulative investment in that over any time period. And that is what Regent Chu is doing. Yep. From a budgeting perspective here, for FY19, for example, the $1.7 million that's in this plan is funded on a recurring basis in the budget before you today. We have found the resources either through it's through the combination of tuition and internal reallocation across the units that we are finding these funds. We don't have to find those funds again on top of that next year. That's recurring. Next year we'll have to find in the budget recurring resources of $1.5 million, not the two combined in terms of a budgeting exercise.
Correct. I understand. Regent Chu.
And I understand. Thank you, Chair Anderson. I understand that, but the problem is, if we didn't need to find it, then we wouldn't have to spend $12.2 million. So, I don't know how you can say we're not going to spend $12.2 million. It just means we find it, and we get to keep finding it in the same place in the future. In fact, in FY22, it's going to cost us $4.5 million more from where we sit today, right?
Mr. Chair, Regent Chu, the 4.2 is the sum of those. So compared to where we sit today, by the time we get there, we will have found $4.2 million of recurring resources. Yes, that is the plan. It's just a different way.
I think, Regent Chu, I think we all have the right answer, but we're just looking at a difference. I think it's $4.5 million recurring, and you're looking how we pay it over 3 years, and I'm looking at every year $4.5 million. And I think Vice President Tonneson is saying they are identifying those funds from our budget exercises. And do you have another question other than that?
No, we can talk offline on this.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, presenters. I would take a little different approach to this because we had, I think, was sort of a cursory discussion about rankings last year, and I didn't really feel like we got to sort of the crux of their importance and their value. We have a sort of our hallmark goal to increase the ranking of the medical school. It's in our progress card. So the idea of sort of abandoning a ranking or diminishing the importance of it for law school, law and medicine are our two most prestigious programs here. And so I happen to value a top 20 ranking, Let's talk about the money. We have set the school up for almost a failure because when we went from the low-cost, good quality school to this high-cost model, all we did was have them run on tuition income. They get no state money. So if Carlson School had the same sort of demand problem that the law school does, we would be subsidizing that by $50 million a year because it's much larger than the law school. So what I'm saying is we set up a business unit to run on one source of income, and that source of income became vulnerable because of the way the industry and the demand cycle is. So we put them into a dangerous business model. We deployed the state and the other O&M money other places that were needed. But I was on the board when this sort of market rate model got created at Carlson, the law school. I remember the conversation. Let the market handle it. Well, that's fine while the market's going up, but when we hit this sort of unforeseen patch, then they're left with a lot of fixed and semi-fixed cost. So, having said that, nobody likes to pay these sort of continual increasing subsidy, and the board's pretty chippy about that. And it has needed a plan, and if we do approve the plan, you're going to have to live with the plan, and if you can't, then the whole thing, we either have to be a top 20 school or we unwind the whole thing and get the subsidy out of this and really let the market go. We're not going to muddle in the middle on the law school. Dean, do you have any?
Dean Jenkins, go ahead, if you want to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Regent Beeson. Yes, I understand and I agree with your assessment. I think that part of what Figure 7 shows in the appendix about the state support, the O&M amount being small, even relative to those that we're competing with, and that put us in this precarious situation. And but this is a plan that we all feel confident in to move us forward in a way that will enable us to be successful and thrive. And I just want to be very clear that the rank, this is not about ego, this is not about a U.S. News rank for the sake of feeling good about ourselves, but I mentioned it and talked about it because of the importance that it plays in admissions and enrollment and the data that we've analyzed. The fact that 41% of students say it is the most important factor for them. The fact that 72% of employers said that the rankings were a factor in their decisions to where to recruit. The fact that our consultant mentioned it with respect to the campaign. So these are things that have real financial consequences that we've really tried to analyze and make sure that we're maximizing our position so that we can thrive and deal with the new market that has emerged.
Thank you, Dean Jenkins. We have a couple more speakers. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So I'm going to be a little bit repetitive, but I'll also be brief. I agree that very much that the gap as it is now is not sustainable for the institution, given the impact that it has, that it's having, that reverberates across the university, and so we just it's not sustainable, and we have to eliminate it. I have to admit that I'm a little confused now on slide 22, but in any case, what would help me, and maybe it would help the board, is a very clear set of metrics associated with the plan to to solve the deficit that the board can track year by year to see, first of all, we see whether we agree with the assumptions behind the metrics, and then secondarily, are we tracking and making progress. And those metrics, are probably assumptions about how many applicants we're going to and admittees we're going to have, and what tuition income will be, and additional steps we're going to take on cost, and maybe how endowment income is going to grow. But we need to see a set of very specific business model metrics that we can track year by year over time, so that we can see if we're getting where we want to go, and if we're not, then I think we're going to have some really tough decisions to make. But I don't. The numbers on page 22 don't provide me with enough granularity and clarity I don't think I'll be able to judge if we're making progress from just this. I need to see a little more detailed plan.
And I think we can get that. I mean, this is a great discussion today, and we'll get that. Thank you, Regents Brigham.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Quickly, 2 questions, Dean Jenkins, if I can. Page 47, I think it is, that was given to us. You're laying out the reasons for the structural imbalance at the law school. The first being applicants, number of students. The second being the increased costs of scholarship then to attract the good students that there's less of. The third seems to be rather vague. You say there the inability to further reduce expenditures to match the decline. What is meant by that? What expenditures could you reduce if you weren't constrained by whatever, contracts, tenure, whatever? Explain a little bit more, be a little more specific with that vagueness.
Dean Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Regents Figham. I think what we're talking about is our efforts to cut costs that we can only...
Which costs? What costs?
Law library.
Law library. So the law library is a large percentage of our budget, 10% of our budget. It is the only public law library in the state, academic library, and it is required for ABA accreditation. So a lot of this is about what we need to do for ABA accreditation, and we're the only unit on campus that pays for its own library.
Thank you. Regents Brigham, you have more?
Anything, too many professors, not too many for professors? You got less students?
So our faculty has been declined. We've 13 faculty over since 2014. We are now at the point where, of course, those faculty don't depart in orderly fashion, so that there are some areas that we need to cover in order to maintain the curriculum.
Mr. Chairman, how many faculty do we have to us?
We have 51 faculty. 51
faculty. And how many students?
We have we have about 600 and 710.
Really? 700.
Yeah. Close enough. Yeah, about 700 among all programs.
Pretty good ratio there. Yeah. Wish I'd had that ratio when I was a teacher. Very, very nice. Last question, Dean. I'm on the West Bank. I got the Carlson School, got the Humphrey School. I come to the law school. Ever thought of, a gift to name this school? I mean, a gift from a prestigious
Brigham School of Law.
A prestigious regent that may have been a graduate of the law school.
McMillan? Dean Jenkins.
They're both listening. but seriously, why don't we have blank School of Law?
We do.
Dean Jenkins?
We would welcome conversations about a transformative gift that would enable us to name the law school.
Thank you. We're going to have Regent Rocha says he's got a question. He'll be brief and take us home from here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment. This follows from what Regent Beeson said in off the. there's a lot of history here, kind of how we got to this structure. And so I don't want to make it sound like the law school's been a passive participant in this conversation. I think at one point there was a mentality about becoming more independent. I know some of the major law schools, I had the pleasure of clerking for Judge Haney's senior circuit status while he was sitting on a panel with the former dean of Yale and the former dean of the Yale Law School right after the separation of those two, and that was an interesting dynamic. So there were some things that were happening when the market was stronger, and because it didn't come to fruition, I think we've got some circumstances now that we have to deal with. And the fact is, we're all on the same team. I just think we have to have a really honest conversation about how we're going to get to certain points. And I think Regent Powell's request for that type of data, in terms of essentially setting benchmarks for where we can go, will bring the board to a position of comfort to help us maximize. I mean, we can admire the problem. Obviously, that's not going to get us very far. We need to come up with some solutions, and it's clear that you're working hard on that, and hopefully we can be a part of that process of getting these things addressed and getting back on track. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent. It was a great discussion today. Great hard questions were asked, good answers. Appreciate your time. Thank you. We're going to move right into capital improvement budget. President Kaler, I think I've got you or Senior Vice President Burnett here, and I think Assistant Vice President Brian Swanson may be at the table. We're going to see what's happening as soon as we're lined up.
Very good. Thank you, Regent Anderson. I bring forward for your review our fiscal 2019 annual capital improvement budget, which includes individual projects costing $1 million or more that are ready to move into design and construction, as well as funding allocations for facility repair and replacement projects. The presentation will include the full value of the university's current request to the state. We will update the capital budget in June when we know the outcome of this legislative session. As you know, our request and our basic mode these days is focused on renewal. We all know the importance of the HEPA request and the request for Greater Minnesota academic renewal, Pillsbury renewal, and Glensheen renewal. And I think this request more than ever reflects your longstanding commitment and mine to ensure that our students, faculty, and staff work, learn, and live in 21st century facilities. So consistent with the goals outlined in the 6-year capital improvement plans, more than 90% of this capital budget goes towards preserving and extending the useful life of existing buildings and infrastructure. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Senior Vice President Burnett and others to take us through the budget.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, President Kaler. And to the point with the legislature in session, we have a substitute today. We called an audible, and I thank Assistant Vice President Swanson for sitting in for Mike Bertelsen, who was called to the Capitol to talk about the request with the Minnesota Senate. In May and June, the board reviews and approves the annual capital improvement budget for the next fiscal year. And this presentation covers the projects we will undertake in the coming year. And the 6-year capital improvement plan serves as the foundation for major capital investments. We will revisit this in the fall when it has been updated for you for review and action. The annual capital budget represents year 1 of that 6-year capital plan, and it includes projects greater than $1 million, as well as approval for pools of R&R, repair and replacement, and HEPA that fund many projects across our institution. The annual capital budget authorizes major projects to move into design and construction this coming fiscal year. Anything appearing on this list must have completed pre-design and be fully funded in order to be included. The capital budget you can see here, as noted, it was very tightly put together. The budget you put forth, HEPA and other projects, totaled about $238 million from the state, $128 million from the university, for a total contemplated budget on the capital side of $367 million. The state capital request update, as I said, Vice President Bertelsen's there now. We've seen both the House number and notional House number at about $78 million of our request, and more than that in the Senate side. We're hopeful that it's certainly below what the governor recommended for the university, but it's a great promising start. And so we will update this based on the end of the legislative session, but again, we're hopeful that our request for HEPA, Pillsbury's in both the governor's budget, the House budget, and the Senate budget, Greater Minnesota academic renewals in pieces of both the House and the Senate, and Glensheen's in the House, but not right now in the Senate. So that's where we sit today, but obviously a lot to do between now and we'll update this when we bring the final budget in June. And so here's that delineation of how much the state we had asked for, how much we would be matching in terms of the projects. Like Pillsbury Hall, it's a 2/3, 1/3. Same with the Greater Minnesota Academic Renewal. That's really projects, just to remind the board, that are not HEAPR eligible, but we need to reprogram space for today's learning environments at Crookston, Morris, and Duluth. So with that, I'm going to turn the next set of slides over to Assistant Vice President Swanson and have you walking through these.
As the President stated, this capital budget is reflective of your goal of advancing the renewal of existing facilities and reducing the number of square feet we have in poor and critical condition. There's a lot on this slide, but it's an important graphic. Facility renewal is a recurring and consistent, predictable problem. Our buildings need upgrades as systems wear out, and the routine investment is important to maximize the life we have of our existing buildings. What this chart illustrates is that we rely on a largely unpredictable source of funding to meet that predictable need. That's the HEAPR and the state request. The two gray lines on the chart represent renewal funding targets. The lower gray line represents the minimum funding we should have to not lose ground on our facility condition assessment scores. And the upper gray line is the target that we need to reach in order to actually make progress on reducing our $4.1 billion 10-year facility renewal need. The maroon bars represent what we currently get in HEAPR and R&R, and the gold bars represent all the other facility renewal investments we have that impact our facility condition. So while the size of our capital request at $317 million seems excessive, that's actually what we need to be investing every year to keep the facilities we have on a trajectory of improving and meeting our goals. HEAPR projects, you're familiar with, we've talked about this a lot. They play a critical role in providing faculty, staff, and students with the facilities necessary to conduct their work. HEAPR is the largest single source of funding available to make these mundane but vital capital improvements to campus building and infrastructure. The 2018 request at the $200 million level includes a large number of projects that impact all the system campuses and the research and outreach centers. You see a couple examples listed here. That list is scaled down when we find out exactly how much we receive from the legislature. But many of the larger, higher impact projects, like the renovation of the old Duluth Chemistry Building, which will be vacant after the CAMS buildings opens, the Andrew Boss Laboratory of Meat Science on the St. Paul campus, the third and final phase of the mechanical engineering project on the Twin Cities campus, and the renovation of the 1950s food science and nutrition building on the St. Paul campus are all dependent on large, at least $100 million HEAPR requests. There's more detail in your docket materials on the line item projects that are included in the annual capital budget this year. This includes the state request as well as some our larger university-funded projects. A quick summary of the repair and replacement pools, including HEAPR, that are funded by various units from around the campus. As a reminder, these are for non-programmatic renovations of existing facilities. They include things like elevator upgrades, parking lot resurfacing, LED light projects, window replacements, security cameras, and these are, a lot of them are just earmarks at this point to determine which projects in the course of a year become critical and need to be done. And then lastly, we have a series, just for information at this point, of projects that have not yet met the requirements to be included in the annual capital budget, but we hope to either have ready for you in June or in some cases at a point during the course of the year. Quick summary on how the funding breaks down on the 368. And with that, I'll turn it back to Senior Vice President Burnett.
So the university debt component, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can just continue on in the interest of time. There's a piece that we would match the state capital request, most notably around Pillsbury and the greater Minnesota renewal projects that we've requested. We have some other pieces that we'll be bringing for your approval in the June meeting. This is just your first look at it, but there are some debt components that match up with other funds to be able to put the capital together to get these projects done. And we're just showing you these different pieces that are coming. So with that, I think the last slide after this one is just the resolution that wouldn't be voted on today, but would be brought forth in June for your action.
Correct. This is just for review today. So you've seen a very preliminary HEPA request for the 2019, or it's not a request, but the 2019 annual capital improvement budget. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, perfect. With that, we are right back on time, and I'm willing to continue, but I'm being told we should take a, notwithstanding Regent Johnson's speech on resiliency and mental toughness this morning, we should take a 10-minute break if we were tough, and get back in here. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break.
That means he doesn't want you to go to the restroom. He was dead. Oh, yeah, it's too late. Dead. It shows they're listening.
That's true. How we doing?
Tough it out.
I think you're right. That each year, each number stays in the base. And to me, I was doing.
If somebody is coming out of school, I want to be.
I was tracking with that.
I didn't get that.
It all stays in the base. I want this. Applicants are going to go like that. Tuition revenue is going to do that. Costs are going to do that because we're going to take out a position a year. We're going to, I mean, I want to
Nope, not at all. You know, exactly how you've done it each time. Do some things according to accreditation, but of course we will.
It'll be fun for you.
I don't think.
Are we ready? All right. Okay, we don't have quite everybody here yet, but just so you can hear me out in the hall, we're going to get going any minute. It's kind of, I'm just like my kids.
Mr. Chair, the world belongs to those who show up. I'd like the record to show that Regent Shoe is here.
Okay. My kids don't show up when I call them either.
I'll second Mr. Regent Shoe's motion.
We know it. His wife charitable causes, graduate student service. I think he'll concern. I don't know really. They'll be off to a faster start than the Regents.
Anybody else come on?
Yeah, University of spend $15 billion. Really? We just that's what happens. Yeah. Like adding. Yeah, right. I'll be adding up. Yeah, right. Oh, I know. Peggy left for graduation.
Oh, they're both gone.
They're both gone, but we picked up on Omar.
He's 7 or 6.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And Ken's.
All right. We've got a quorum here now, so we're going to get started. Regent Beeson reminded me to say that the world belongs to those who show up. Right, Regent Beeson? Okay. So where are we? We're on the Endowment Fund. Associate Vice President Stuart Mason, you are going to give us some information, if you're here.
Yes, right there.
Okay, there he is. If you want to come up and give us some information. This was a review item back in February. Gosh, this seems like a long time ago. And we're going to hear a little bit more about it, and we're going to take some action. So, Associate Vice President Mason, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Anderson. I have only a couple of comments to refresh the board's remembrance of our presentation in February. We're introducing two elements to the endowment fund policy, which are found in Section 6, Subdivision 4, which under permissible activities. And in summary, they are Subdivision 4A is to allow for leverage of the overall fund up to 110% gross leverage with the utilization of derivatives to obtain additional exposure to desired asset classes up to the 110% limitation. Secondly, in that same Subdivision 4B is to enable us to make co-investments with managers with whom we already have a committed facility. Co-investment, if you remember, is an investment directly in a company or a security that's already in one of the underlying portfolios in which we're invested. And our desire to do that is, generally speaking, the co-investments are made with lower or in many cases no fees attached, so it eases the fee burden on doing business with that particular manager. Co-investments are also most frequently that manager's best ideas, so think about an opportunity to enhance the return at the same time lowering the fee for that particular manager. So that would be the rationale for the two proposed changes.
Okay, and we have the endowment fund, that policy right in front of us. Do we have any questions? I have a question, Mr. Mason. When you say derivatives, when we've talked before, the endowment fund is a pretty bland investment style, if you will. So we don't have a lot of derivatives and things out there. Is that the truth, or do we have more and more every day?
We wouldn't view derivatives as an exotic investment strategy, and they are utilized across the various asset classes to rebalance or to change the emphasis of particular investments that we have, particularly used by our hedge fund portfolio, but by a number of the other managers that we have would use derivatives in one form or another. And this proposal would enable us to engage an expert in the use of those to add additional exposure, primarily in the fixed income area.
Okay.
If I can just comment.
Senior Vice President Burnett is going to comment.
And I think the committee should know that this has been vetted with the Investment Advisory Committee on a couple of occasions, and full support of that various incredible group of fund managers here in the Twin Cities that devote their time to giving us advice. And so I think this is something that most modern portfolios of our size and sophistication have, and we put a pretty conservative limit on both the co-investment level and the leverage, the synthetic leverage level, and it was unanimously recommended by the Investment Advisory Committee.
Okay. With that being heard, is there a motion to recommend adoption of the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents policy?
Second.
So moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? We had a little. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We are now going to go to some real estate transactions, and I think in the absence of Vice President Bertelson, Assistant Vice President Leslie Kruger may be here. I see Mike Volna, Associate Vice President Mike Volna is also here. Just to remind you, even though we did not have finance and operations in Rochester, these were on information items in there for your own personal review, so we are taking them by review and action today. There's 3 separate items. I think we'll go 1, 2, 3 or ABC, and if you'll explain the first one to us, we'll get a motion on it and move from there and then go on to the second one, if that's okay.
Perfectly fine.
Okay. Vice President Volna.
Chair Anderson, members of the committee, thank you very much. We have 3 items before you today that are review and action transactions. The first one is, Chair Anderson said, is the sale of 2642 University Avenue. That is the old Minnesota Geological Survey building. It's up the road, University Avenue, roughly across the street from KSTP-TV. The building has sat vacant for at least 3 years. The proposed sale price is $2.15 million, which is at the upper end of the range of the appraisals that we received on the property. While the location is close to campus, it is a very old building. We recently, or a while back, we had a condition assessment done that estimated it would take $6.4 million to bring it up to rehabitable condition. So clearly to do something with just that building is expensive, and to replace it and to do something else on a very small footprint would be even more expensive. Based on that and the fact that it continues to sit vacant, we felt that the current offer was a fair market value and fair price, and our recommendation would be to sell that property.
Thank you. So let's see if we can entertain a motion to recommend approval of the sale of 2642 University Avenue, St. Paul.
So moved. Second.
So moved and seconded. We have it on the table. Is there discussion? Regional Mara.
Chair Anderson, this is a broader question. I've asked it before. Apologies for not recalling the answer. When we sell property, so we're going to sell this for $2 point something million, where does the money go?
Chair Anderson, Regent Omari. Typically, when we sell property, we have several different accounts, which are the real estate accounts. And unless the board or some other policy has made provision that the money goes into something special, those transactions go into the real estate account for Twin Cities. With the next one, it would be the real estate account for Morris. And that money sits there and is used for other real estate transactions down the road.
To purchase other...
To finance other real estate activities, yes.
Thank you.
Vice President Burnett.
Regent Omari, in this case, it's my understanding this building has a negative, has a deficit that this will help fall because of money we've spent with no fund source behind it. So,
correct.
So
correct.
The net of this will be about $1 million to the real estate fund because I think that account has about a minus.
It's about a $950,000 deficit.
Negative. So it clears up a negative balance with respect to real estate, but then it will sit there and be available for use for other real estate needs. The net will. So that's good to know.
Thank you. Further discussion on this building? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. In general, I'm not a big fan of selling property around the university because we typically seem to always sell low and buy high when we need them, when we need the land. And I know this isn't as close as some of the other pieces, but I'm just concerned that we're gonna 10 years from now, Regents might be sitting around here thinking, hey, I wish we still had that piece of property, just like we sit around here and say, hey, I wish we still had that piece of property, but or the hospital, for example. So I think I'm torn on this thing. I think I'll support it, but I'd hate to see us sell anything closer to the university.
Appreciate the comment. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some local knowledge about this because when our bank was looking for a headquarters site, we did look at it. I went through it. We thought it was overpriced so much that we didn't make an offer. The issue with this building is that it lacks any real parking. And there's a lot next to it that could be leased, but I think, and I was surprised it didn't sell, frankly, but it's been exposed to the market for a long time. It's a very strategic location, but it needs total renovation in addition to getting securing parking.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, I'm going to call for the vote. All those in favor of the sale of 2642 University Avenue, St. Paul, Minnesota, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Vice President Volna.
Chair Anderson, the second item then under the review and action is a proposed sale of 0.19 acres of land across the street from the Morris campus in Morris, Minnesota. If you look at the map that's on page 189, you can see a very tiny little yellow triangle below the Highway 28 symbol. That is the parcel of land. If you actually look at it on a Google map, you'll see it's surrounded by residential homes. Originally, there was no street that separated this little triangle from the campus, but when the city or the county or whoever put a street in, it sort of stranded this. The proposed sale price is $4,888.20. I can tell you I don't know how they came to that number, but it's a fairly nominal number. Frankly, for the campus's sake, their perspective is that they probably spend about that much every year on land care costs in terms of mowing the land, shoveling or blowing the snow off the sidewalks. In addition, because it's across a pretty busy street, they have to get people and equipment over there, and so there is some safety issues. So from their perspective, they see no future use for this. As you can see, there's plenty of other land around, and they would not consider this a strategic parcel.
At this time, I'll ask for a motion to recommend approval of the sale of the 0.19 acres of property located in the northwest corner of the Morris campus. Is there a second? Second. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor of selling that Morris property signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Vice President Bowman.
Chair Anderson, members of the committee, the third and final item then is the proposed lease for a 10-year term for collaborative classroom space and then a 15-year term for lab space in the new Discovery Square building in Rochester, Minnesota. As you know, we will be one of the anchors for this, and we will have 9,383 square feet in the property. The total cost of it is quite expensive, but we have worked hard with the developers and the Discovery Square people to bring the cost down so that it fits within Rochester's budget, and I can tell you at this point they do feel that it is an affordable price for their budget. There are also $3.6 million in build-outs that will be required. 1.5 of that 3.6 will be paid for by the city itself through the sales tax that they collect for higher education spending within the Rochester area. The remainder of it will either be paid through the recovery of past sales tax that Rochester campus can recover, or some small incremental funds on top of that they will need to spend. The debt that or loan that we will make them primarily finances the recollection of that, so it really is almost a zero cost to them, even though the total build-out will be $3.6 million. With that, I will stand for any questions on this.
Okay, first let's see if we can entertain a motion to sell or to rent this space in the Destination Medical Center in Rochester. Is there a motion for that?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second's been moved and seconded to rent 9,383 rentable square feet of collaborative classroom in the Destination Medical Center, Rochester. Any questions? Any? Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and I'm going to ask this question with a little trepidation. I'm supportive of this, and it kind of comes on faith of what I've seen in Rochester with the long-term plans there, but I just have a challenge coming to grips with how this relates ultimately to, spatially, to University Square and all the things we just saw 2 months ago. It looks so far apart that what I have trouble getting my head around is, how does all this fit together at the end of the execution of this vision? Because it seemed like a pretty good distance, and 2 blocks isn't too far to walk, but when it comes to a holistic experience for students, as we go from 2 blocks to 4 blocks, and we're moving on the other side of that, the space where people live, just starts to feel disconnected and disjointed. And I hate to ask such a strategic question. I'm supportive of this because I understand where it's coming from, but I'd love it if I could get some kind of a sense of how does this red square fit together with University Square, and how do these things all look to a student or a faculty member instead of it. We hear about people having to walk over to the clinic and surgery center from the classrooms here, and that's too far. I don't want to make all that work. This looks like it's that problem squared, but maybe I'm making up an issue and I don't need to.
I think I've got 2 people that want to answer that question. One's the president, one's the senior vice president, so we'll go with seniority and president.
Thank you. So I win. Thank you, Chair Anderson. I thought the same thing, Regent McMillan, but then I realized that is much closer than it is from Pioneer Hall to Falwell Hall, and people on this campus make that walk a whole lot of the time. So, and it will be skywayed. And it also happens to be where the space where we could put laboratories in is, and there isn't any other closer. So ideal, no. Unavoidable, I think so.
Thanks for that. With your permission, I'll follow up. So that answers the student side of it for me. I agree. They don't have to go very far. What I was referencing when I hear about faculty members is the practicing, the medical school faculty members that, even 2-3 blocks for them, and then going to do a surgery here or work in a lab there, and it just feels disjointed. So you've answered it from a student standpoint, not too far. Has there been faculty input in this long-term design? I'm guessing there has, but.
I'm gonna have Senior Vice President. Those of you that were down in Rochester for when was that? The March meeting. We did. Many of us toured that area, and I know Chancellor Carroll, who is on her way up here now, was really, in my opinion, excited about this project. So while she's sitting down, let's have. Okay, we'll let her Chancellor Carroll, do you want to answer the questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair Anderson, Regent. One of the exciting things about UMR's location and our approach to facilities and space is that we are optimizing the existing context of downtown Rochester, which is so well aligned with our academic focus on health science, so that the downtown area being medically focused, it's a vibrant space for student learning, and faculty are very much a part of the space planning. It is, of course, complex and controversial at times, and yet the notion of the distance between the faculty space and this building has not been an item of concern for faculty.
Okay. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Part of the answer may also be that the property that we bought a couple of years ago, I think, is in the Discovery Square. As pointed out, so it's a little south, but I mean, and it's all very embryonic. But the land that we have down there, would that potentially hold administrative offices and faculty offices? Could you remind me what the current plan is for that parcel?
Chair Anderson, Regent Beeson, those plans are still in development as we look broadly at our enrollment in academic programs and look forward to 5 and 10 years. The specificity about the use of that land will emerge, and we'll certainly be bringing that to you. In terms of the connection of the One Discovery Square project that is before you today and the land that has been purchased and the city sales tax dollars that have supported that land purchase, those two areas are to be connected by currently under development Discovery Walk. At the very close proximity and part of the overall design of the downtown with the Destination Medical Center, Endeavor has those two segments well connected, and in fact the connector, Discovery Walk, will be complete before our plans for how that land would be used will be complete.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. This is not my world at all, but I'll ask these questions anyway. And I guess the first question is this a particularly, is it a pricey neighborhood that we're investing in? Because it's, the space that we're getting for $200,000 a year is, I think, about the size of this room. I mean, just eyeballing it. So it's not a lot of space, and so the question is. It just seems like a lot of money for the space that we're getting, and
maybe the people, Chancellor Carroll, Senior Vice President Burnett, maybe Vice President Volna that worked on the lease can talk a little about that. Somebody.
Well, and I'll turn it over to Mike and the team who real estate. We negotiated pretty hard with Mortensen. The other adjacency is they're co-locating with Mayo. That's one of the things that is a unique experience for the UMR students, is being in a building with Mayo researchers and as Chancellor Carroll talked about. So our real estate staff drove a pretty hard bargain, but this is one of the upper ends of our leases across the system, and it's not an inexpensive proposition.
Chair Anderson, Regent Powell, I would agree with Senior Vice President Burnett. This is a very expensive lease compared to what we're used to seeing. I would say that the development down there is exploding, and so we are sort of getting in a little bit on the supply-demand perspective there. Also, keep in mind that there are some lab spaces here, and so lab spaces get built out at a different standard than office spaces, and so that is driving a bit of the cost as well.
Chancellor Carroll.
Yes. Chair Anderson, Regents, we expect that this lease will solve our lab classroom space need long term, and so future facilities to be developed with public-private partnerships and other creative means will not need to be this expensive, because our lab facility challenge will be solved for the foreseeable future. And this is quite strategic for us, not only the proximity and the undergraduate research opportunities that are emanating from that proximity, but also that we have a long-term solution for our needs for lab classroom space.
My personal opinion on this, on the take, we toured that area, and I noticed the building in downtown Rochester. I have a feeling buildings are going to go up and they're going to get more expensive. I would assume we probably have the ability to sublease this at some point in time if it didn't work out for us.
Chair Anderson, at this point, the future extensions are options and so forth. So we have, after 10 years or 15 years, depending on which section you're talking about, we do have the option not to renew and not to stay in the building. But as Chancellor Carroll said, the lab space is a key component of it. I would also remind the Regents that with the next item that we'll be discussing in the review, which is another lease down there, we are strategically trying to package together leases as a way of solving the space and enrollment sort of horizon for the next 10 years without having to invest in our own facilities down there. So to that extent, this makes sense for the longer term as well.
And to the Chancellor, who knows the university maybe better than any of us, you look at this as a good investment?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. And Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, just following off that question, and I want to make sure I understand it if I'm casting a vote, and I should know more about this than I do. The lab space is already built out or will be built out?
Chair Anderson, Regent Rocha, the building is not yet up, so the lab space and the office space will be built to our specs as it goes up.
And Mr. Chair, and built into our rate is they are going to be paying for the build out.
Chair Anderson, Regent Rocha, the $3.6 million will pay for the finishes inside, so the lab hoods, vents, bench spaces, that kind of stuff will all be paid for with our money, but the basic structure, shell, and the layout and so forth will be built to our specs by the contractor as they build it.
Right. And the final question is, so it would seem that do we have any comps or anything that would show in that area this is what we'd be paying per square foot with that level of investment and so on? Do we have that at our disposal easily?
Vice President Volna.
Chair Anderson, Regent Rocha, actually we don't, because this kind of development is fairly new in Rochester. This is really part of the $500 million Destination Medical Center, and what's currently down there, I think you all had an opportunity to tour it back in March. There really isn't anything like this right now. What's gone up recently that's new in the area is housing, apartments, condos, so forth. So this kind of an office building is really one of the first ones that the Mayo is going to be occupying, will be occupying. They're looking for other tenants. But this sort of is one of the early ones, so we don't have the comps.
I'm sorry, at least, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If I can just echo one, Mr. Chair and Regent Rocha, if you think about the size of the Rochester campus, about 450 students.
Undergrads, yeah.
All
697
undergrads.
Total.
The economics of this, while expensive on a per square foot, is much less expensive than trying to solve with a building of your own. Being a piece of this building, we've looked at these analyses, and it would be many multiples of this lease to solve by building down at this small number of students on our property. So the reason we've worked with the administration at Rochester to try and put their leases out is to have the best economics for the space in this campus and to stay more of a leaseor than an owner, as we typically do on the other 4 campuses of the university. So this is, while at a per square foot in this development, one of our higher leases in the system, it's still less expensive than building something ourselves for that number of students, because it's a small number of students.
Sure, I appreciate that, but it's not so much a function of whether it's less expensive than this, is it more than we should be paying or less than we should, that's my question. I would just think that we would we have peers to measure everything that we do around here. I would think that we would know what other space of that nature would be. So I'm still surprised by that.
Chair Anderson, Regent Rocha, we did negotiate from the starting point down from where they were, so it's not like we did not negotiate hard and we did not just accept their pricing and their terms and such. We negotiated very hard, and we were able to get concessions. We were able to get some price breaks, but as As I've said, as Senior Vice President Burnett has said, on a per square foot, this is a pretty expensive one. But the lab space is key to the campus's needs in solving that.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a premium. What we get in exchange is a co-brand with mail. We get new construction space, and we get finished out a highly technical plumbing systems heavy situation. There's probably, I don't know, but I would guess there are no other lab spaces sitting around town right now. They're all probably on the Mayo campus, and so that it's not like finding another office space where we could, get a true comp. This is a build to suit.
That's correct.
Any other discussion? Regent Shue.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. I'm struggling here to understand what the master plan is. We have the University Square. I don't know how long the lease is on that. Is it like 15 years or something like that? And then we have this property south of 6th Street that I was under the understanding that we were going to develop. And then we have the Discovery Square, which is kind of in the middle. And I guess, I can see how that would be a good solution for today, but without knowing what tomorrow, 10, 15 years down the road, I think this lease is a 30-year lease, but it looks like we can cancel it after 15, if I'm not mistaken. So, it's a 15. Where are we going to be in 15 years with that campus? That's, I guess, the question. I'd like to.
Anybody want to tackle that answer? Vice President Volna, Chancellor Carroll.
Chair Anderson, Regent Shue, this does move us forward toward where we will be in 15 years. We're not ready to identify precisely what that will be, but it is not a short-sighted decision. Rather, it's an investment decision that meets a current need and allows for continued growth of the campus in a way that is fiscally responsible. So we have some principles for our facilities decision making as we continue to grow this campus. And the first one is stewardship, and the second is partnership, and the third is location, that we will be in downtown Rochester for the reasons I named before, so that we can solve both short, mid, and long-term need given our academic focus with this lease, and optimize how we are co-located and optimize the undergraduate research opportunities that will contribute to our growth. We do not want to put forward a plan for what will be developed on that land 15 years from now before we have made strategic priority decisions and have further information about enrollment trends.
Follow-up,
Regent Shue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chancellor Carroll, how long is the lease on University Square?
That is an item on the agenda.
Next on the agenda.
I didn't read it yet.
Regent Powell.
Well, I guess I'm just, what I want to say is I understand why we're doing it, and that it's probably the best solution right now, but longer term, building out and building, very high capability lab space in the middle of a super pricey shopping district. It's kind of the Emerald City there right now. It's going to be, I don't think it's longer term, and I don't think it's a good way to go. If you wouldn't put a lab, I don't think, in that there. It just doesn't seem like a good fit to me.
Regent Powell, maybe a point of clarification. This is a different building than the one they're in now at University Square. This is a research building. This is a building where Mayo intends to do research. So it's built...
Is it all lab?
Well, yeah, it's labs and collaborative space. So that was why the adjacency made sense. We talked when we were in Rochester, if you recall, the first thing we looked at was expanding lab space in their current footprint at University Square, which is in that mall, and the building systems won't allow it. So this was the next best alternative to develop the program, develop the campus. It's still a very young campus, very small in scale, but this is not a shopping center. This is a laboratory research building for Mayo.
I stand corrected.
Okay, thank you. I think, are we ready to, Regent McMillan?
Regent Anderson, Chair Anderson, I was just going to reassert my support for this. I was the one who started the dialogue, and hearing some of the answers and the good back and forth, I do support us moving forward with a plan that, while a little difficult to fully envision, I have faith in our leadership that they've brought it together and will continue to pull it together.
The discussion is good. You know, in Rochester I've been down there 3-4 times now. It's a different campus, and maybe the campus of the future. I don't know, but they do things differently, and they seem to work. So at this point in time, it's on the table. I'm going to ask for a vote. All those in favor of the lease for the collaborative classroom and laboratory space at the Destination Medical Center in Rochester signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're going to have more real estate transactions, but just for review, so we won't have to vote on these today. Again, there's 3 of them. I think we've got Vice President Volna and Vice President Leslie Kruger there, and take it away. We don't have to vote on any of them, so you want to explain them all, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. Chair Anderson, members of the committee, we do have 3 items for review. The first item, as we earlier alluded to, is an amendment to an existing lease in Rochester, Minnesota. This is the University Square building. We have gone back and renegotiated the current lease to add extensions. We believe that the pricing is good. You will notice that the price does jump. Keep in mind that the current lease there has had 0 price increases over the life of the lease, so we've had a very good deal. In addition, they were willing to fold in some of the mid-lease build-out and alteration costs into the lease, so we're essentially paying for them that way. The extension of the lease does provide flexibility to UMD. It provides them with up to 7 years across 3 different options to extend this lease out to 2032, I believe. It gives them the flexibility to not have to invest in space, but to lease space as their enrollment grows and their program matures. We felt this was a very good lease adjustment and a lease extension, and it supports their direction. So this will be the first item that we will be coming forward with.
Okay.
Second item that we will be coming forward with for action next month is relocation of the Sand Plains Research Farm. This is in Becker, Minnesota. We have leased land from Excel Energy since, I believe, 1972. Excel recently notified us that they were ending the lease. You may have seen in the news that I believe it's Northern Metals is moving out to Becker, Minnesota. This is where they are moving. This has been a bit of a challenge for CFANS because they do research out there and have done research out there for about 40 years, so the longitudinal data has been very important. You will notice from the map that is on page 198 that we have been able to secure 400 acres from Excel, about a few miles southwest of the current location. The lease rates are very good, but this will entail about a $3 million infrastructure build-out cost to replace buildings, wells, irrigation systems, and so forth for the farming operation. We do have a financing plan with them that we will be working on, and this one I would say is currently being finalized. Excel has been working with us on this, but we have not finalized this. We do expect that by the time we come back in June that this lease will be finalized. I should also note that we have Dean Brian Buer from the College of Food, Ag, and Nutrition Science here, and if anybody wants wants to ask questions, he's certainly in the back and can certainly respond to questions. The third item that we will be coming forward with then in June will be the sale of 435.546 acres of land out at Umore Park. As you can see from the map that's included in the materials, it is a plot of land that is in the northwest corner of the Umore Park area. It is adjacent to the mining, gravel mining that is going on. It's across Highway 42 from downtown Rosemount. We talked to the board about the change in direction and about the plan to put an RFP out last summer when we did an update on Umore. The price that we have negotiated with the seller, Newland Acquisition Companies, is $13.1 million. That also, they also have agreed to fund $4 million of infrastructure. Newland is a large, very large developer. They buy large blocks of land. They're a master developer. So after they buy the land, they put in the infrastructure, and then they sell pieces of it to builders and smaller developers that actually do the vertical development and building on the land. And with that, I will stand for any questions on any of these.
Okay. You've got a brief assessment of these three projects or these three real estate transactions. Are there any questions? Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And item number 3, under the Newland project, if I may call it that, if I'm correct, the Turkey Research Facility sits on that land. What are the plans for that research facility? And perhaps Dean Buer could comment on that.
Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, the Turkey facility is actually just southwest of the border. The agreement with Newland requires that we move it within 5 years after closing, and closing is specified in the agreement as up to 2 years out. So potentially we have up to 7 years to move the Turkey facility. We know that this is an important step to take both for CFANS as well as for the development of this area, and so University Services is fully committed to working through the plans with CFANS to identify a location and move that facility.
Mr. Chairman, not to be pro-kill, but there's a new $8 million poultry research facility about 100 miles west of here that could use some more turkeys and so on and so forth. But
you'd like to give us a more clear location of what community it's in?
But this discussion has taken place before, and I know what the obstacles are. The obstacles are, members of the board, researchers don't want to travel or live 100 miles from the metro area. But I think it is incumbent to think about at least moving into a rural area where turkeys and livestock and poultry are, as opposed to having it in the metro area.
Dean Buer, would you like to comment on Regent Johnson's assessment of the turkey farm?
Chair Anderson, thank you. Regent Johnson, I'm Brian Buer, I'm Dean of College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences. Regarding the turkey facility, we've been in planning for about 2 years now on a feasibility of relocating and what the design of that facility might be. To the facilities you're talking about in Wilmer, those are primarily diagnostic facilities and testing facilities. Our facility is one that uses live turkeys and does production research on those turkeys, so there's several barns. It's a different operation, and we are considering now actually strategic planning around where do we locate research facilities. And we are certainly discussing the notion that we often have extension specialists that go out state to do their work, that the location of it's going to be in a place we think that has the most impact, both on we have to accommodate student teaching opportunities as well as the research opportunities to accomplish both of those at the same time. So we're considering all options, I would say, are on the table as we look at the best mission-driven investment we can make.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Regent Spigum had a question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. On regards to the Umore Park, 435 acres, $30,000 an acre should reach full corn. I can tell you that. Tell me about, did we receive any other proposals this last fall, this last winter, other than the one from Newland?
Vice President Bolden.
Did we receive any other proposals that we may have either said no was better or?
Chair Anderson, Regent Swigum, we received one formal proposal. That was from Newland. We received many inquiries and held meetings with developers. The challenge with this is that 435 acres is a very large plot, and most of the developers that we thought might respond, who are, let's say, local or regional, are not in that size of operation. So this is a very large plot of land, and essentially it takes a lot of capital for somebody to take down this land and hold it and invest in the infrastructure for the amount of time. So in that respect, we were not surprised. We would have liked to have gotten more, but especially given that the price that we negotiated is above what we came in with the two appraisals, we felt that it was a fair price.
But it was the only proposal?
It was the only formal proposal that was submitted by the deadline, yes, sir.
Thank you. Regent Chu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. Dean Bohr, since you're now up there, I was going to ask if you could predict whether or not plants will grow faster or slower next to a nuclear plant. You don't have to answer
Sure,
that.
Anderson.
That's not my real question.
Okay.
Why wouldn't we consider purchasing land, or I don't know what we're doing up there as opposed to farming on Umore parkland? It just seems kind of odd that we're going to lease land for 30 years to do experiments on, and maybe that's something we decided to do in the 1970s, but it just seems to me that we would want to just own the land so that we wouldn't have to deal with this in 30 years.
Chair Anderson, Regent Chu, in fact, we've asked Excel several times if they would be willing to sell, and they are not willing to sell. Excel Energy has a new development focus for generating additional business for power, and they have plans for that land, which include some development. We have, like I say, we've asked them a couple times if they'd be willing to sell us, because we would prefer the certainty of owning the land, but they have not been willing to sell.
Thank you. Regent Beeson, last question here and we'll move on.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's encouraging that a developer of this type would want to take on, frankly, this much land in one fell swoop. I didn't think the market would recover this quickly, and having a housing developer on the site will cause other developers to show up. There's going to be a hole in the ground at some point when we're done mining, and that's going to be the size of Lake Calhoun. And I don't know who gets to pay for the water. Maybe the water will just settle in there and all the public improvements. But it's good to see that their development is moving along at this rate, and money in the bank for us of this amount is helps recoup our investment, quote investment, because we spent $1 million before the first gravel was mined and before this kind of income. At some point, we're going to be in the positive on when that's going to be in terms of income from this project.
Thank you. These will be back in June, and so if you have questions, you can get a hold of these people and talk to them. And in the meantime, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to move on. I think we've got Vice President Kathy Brown, Senior Director Patty Dion, here to talk about a collective bargaining agreement.
Chair Anderson, members of the committee, we have before you today a collective bargaining agreement between the Regents and District Number 1 of the Graphic Communications Conference of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local 1B, and I will let Patty Dion describe this contract.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, Senior Vice President Burnett, members of the committee. This is our second smallest union in the university. There are 6 employees in this group, and they all work in the printing plant on the Twin Cities campus. This group provides bindery finishing services as a final step in the printing process. Examples of the printed materials that they work with include alumni magazines, undergraduate recruitment materials, athletic tickets, programs and media guides. This is a 3-year contract which covers the time period from November 1st, 2017 through October 31st, 2020. Our relationship with this union goes back many years, and this is a contract that has been in place all of those years. So this negotiation focused primarily on wages. In the first and second year of the agreement, the salary range and the employee's salary will be adjusted by 2%. This is equivalent to the wage parameters we had with our other represented employee groups. In the third year of this agreement, we have agreed to adjust the wages by the same amount as will be determined for the civil service employee group. So we were not committed to a particular number, but tied it to what happens in the rest of the university. So with that, we ask for your approval of this labor agreement.
I'm going to entertain a motion to approve of the second. Okay, it's been moved and second before I even read it, so how about that? So at this time, is there any discussion on it? Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I think I've seen their work. It's nice. Putting on the governance policy hat, as we go forward in some of our conversations, the review action in the would it be sort of traditional for a bargaining unit agreement to be review action in the same meeting, or is there a reason why we wouldn't do review one month and action the next month?
And I apologize for that, but I believe it came up. You can explain the circumstances here?
Historically, we have brought these contracts forward for both review and approval at the same meeting. When there are occasions where there's some complicating factors that may need to be considered, it would be certainly possible for the review and approval at 2 separate meetings. But historically, we've done it both at the same meeting.
And that's very traditional in labor relations, because once we end up with tentative agreements, the union usually will take their vote first, and then they are waiting for their wages on the employer's vote. And to do the review and then delay another month for action is actually delaying the implementation of the wages for the employees many times. So it's a pretty traditional practice in labor relations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just noticed that I believe you said this wasn't going to be effective till November, so I don't think you'd run into that.
It's retroactive.
Oh, to last November. Yes. Ah, okay. I stand corrected. All right, just as we go forward.
Okay. Any other discussion? All those in favor of approval of the proposed labor agreement with District Council number 1 of the Graphic Communications Conference and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Local 1B signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think we're now to our consent report, and I'm going to ask General Counsel Peterson if he'd step up. Just so you know, you've got purchases over $1 million. We've got the contract for additional commercial paper dealer. We have the amendment to some civil service rules, and we have 2 coaches contracts, one of which I want General Counsel Peterson just to explain, because your packet, you got one, and we needed to make a little amendment, and I think you all got an amendment on that today. Very briefly, General Counsel Peterson, could you tell us about that amendment?
Certainly, Chair Anderson. Good afternoon. With regard to the Lindsay Whalen contract, you have the body of the contract as part of your board record, and I will alert you to section 3.6, which is on page 13. It relates to the coach's right to terminate and the fee that the coach would be obligated to pay in that circumstance. Last evening we recognized that there was a drafting error in that paragraph, the second sentence of that paragraph starts out, except for the termination fee, and then goes on to say the university will not be responsible for any payments or benefits after the date of such a termination. That initial phrase, except for the termination fee, needs to be deleted because the termination fee relates to the coach's termination fee, not the university's obligation, which is addressed by the second sentence. So the only thing that is changing in the amendment is paragraph 3.6 has been revised to eliminate the phrase except for the termination fee. It is not a substantive change. The change will eliminate some confusion. The reason why that mistake appears is because that sentence was transferred over from another paragraph in the document that relates to the university's right to terminate.
Does that explain it to everybody, or does anybody need a question? Okay. At this time, I will take, I guess there's no questions on the Regent Rocha.
I move the consent agenda.
Move the consent agenda and take a motion. Is there a second for the consent agenda? Second? Moved and seconded the consent agenda. Any other discussion on anything?
Mr. Chairman.
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, I see Director Coyle is here. I just have a brief question in regard to the Whalen contract. How does Ms. Whalen's contract as head basketball coach at the university stack up with other Big Ten women's basketball coaches? Where are we in the rank order?
Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, her salary puts her in the bottom quarter of the Big Ten.
Mr. Chairman, what would be the bottom salary and what would be the top salary? And then we also, you know, in full transparency, we have to talk about the benefits and all. I just asked salary, so what's the bottom, what's the top?
Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, I don't have those numbers in front of me, so I don't want to speculate on what the bottom, but if my memory serves me correct, her pay is 13 out of 14 in the Big Ten.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the contract we have before us, if she's here for 5 years, I believe would put her something of 500. I don't see it now.
547.
How much?
547,000.
Where would that? What's the top, Mr. Chairman? What's the top salary of a coach on this basketball?
In the country? I'd imagine. Oh,
just Big Ten.
Chair Anderson, I apologize. I can get that information to you. I just don't know off the top of my head what the top salary is in the Big
We have the consent agenda on the table. It's been motioned and seconded. Is there any other discussion?
Chair Anderson, just a quick question about the amendment to Patino's contract. I didn't see the old contract, so I'm just wondering which component of paragraph 2.9 is being added. Is it the private airfare or airplane where there's fundraised dollars that's being added? So the 40 hours is staying the same, and then we're just adding the additional fundraising component? Is that right?
Athletic Director Coyle.
Yeah, Chair Anderson, in Regional Mari, it's similar to what we did with Coach Fleck a few months ago. If he needs additional time, per my approval, he can use fundraised dollars earmarked for that to serve that purpose.
So it's just the fundraise piece. So yes. My guess was right. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? Regent Shue.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Director Coyle, is 40 hours enough in general for a basketball coach to spend in a year?
Athletic Director Coyle.
Chair Anderson, Regent Shue, you know, if you look across our peers in the Big Ten and the Autonomy 5 conferences, they vary from contract to contract in terms of what those hours are. You all were kind enough to give us the flexibility with Coach Fleck and his recruiting needs a few months ago, and we're just asking for the same flexibility. You know, Coach Patino will come close to those 40 hours and may exceed those 40 hours, and we just want to have the same opportunity if we had fundraised dollars, if we need those extra hours to get that done.
Okay, thank you.
President Kaler.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I've used the miracle of the internet to discover that in the Big Ten, the highest paid women's basketball coach is $1.125 million. The lowest is $300,000. The average is $663,000, and that's 2016-17 data.
Thank you. I will just say, as an aside, up in little old Alexandria, I have more people that expressed elation and gratification that we have hired Lindsay Whalen as our basketball coach than any other thing I've been involved with at the University of Minnesota. People come up to me every day, and I like to take credit, but I can't. So,
Maybe
but anyway, I've heard
them
that.
down for a game.
Anyway, the consent agenda is on the table. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. What do we got next, Jason? Information items. Anybody need to know anything about the information items? They're in your packet, or I will volunteer Senior Vice President Burnett to say something.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, you know, I feel a little bit off balance on this, but we've got this St. Paul Strategic Facilities Plan that appears to be wrapping up fall of 2018 by the timeline. It just really seems like the system-wide strategic plan would be really essential for being able to guide the work of that particular committee. So this is my only opportunity to weigh in on that. So I just want to make sure that I put that on the record.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Regent Rocha, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's going to be opportunity. It's not baked yet. It's just initial start. So how that fits into the system-wide strategic plan, we completely agree.
Thank you.
And how the St. Paul campus fits into that's very important.
Thank you.
Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson and Regent Rocha. There's considerable agreement around the board, and the board chair shares your concern there and the opportunity to be heard. So thank you, Senior Vice President Burnett and President Kaler, for that opportunity. Lots of interest here, and I think getting it in as an information item so we can start chewing on it is really a good idea. So
thank you. President Kaler.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Yeah, there should be no need for concern. This is an opportunity to get a running start on something that we know is a problem. It's not baked. It will just enable a more rapid texturing of the system-wide plan into impact on St. Paul, where we know we need to make it. Thank you.
I'll entertain a motion for adjournment. So moved. Is there a second? All in favor?
7 minutes over.